He then seized a rope and ascended up to the masthead, examining the lines and canvas. Lastly, he went below. When he returned, he said, "A little born and neglected, but she is a splendid vessel as far as 10 condoggers go." Tankin more than inquired why. It nodded, "And that's Bernie in the cabin, right?" "Pretty sure," Adrian replied. "Then, that means this isn't just some subterranean salt lake." "What do you mean?" "This boat sailed here from the Palace of the Far Winds. This must open out to the Goblin Sea. Some cove the Barlin Gazelle discovered, that goes underground, and is passable all the way under Albin to here. That's how the Gazelle have been getting in, and managing to send scouting parties around." Ambertonly, Adrian said, "As nice as all that as our began. How are we going to get this vessel into the water? We aren't why." "Tell them it'll do that all by itself in about 6 hours. Huh, this vessel is just going to jump in the water." "In 6 hours?" Marvin inquired incredulously. "He's talking about the tide," Arista said. "It's low tide right now or near it. I'm guessing at high tide. The watermark will be up to the cliff's edge. There won't even be a beach here. Of course, the vessel may still be touching bottom. We'll set sail and hope the wind can pull us. If not, we'll have to catch off." "Catch off?" Marvin inquired and glanced at Arista with this time shrugged. "You take the ship's anchor, put it on a launch, paddle it out, drop it in the water, and then with the capstan, you crank and pull the vessel toward the anchor. It's not a fun drill. Sometimes the anchor doesn't catch, and sometimes it catches too well. Either way, turning the captain is never pleasant. All I can say is thank Maribo we have Eldon. Of course, a vessel this size doesn't have a launch, so we need to make something to float the anchor out with. Since we have 6 hours to kill, we might as well do that. I'll need Royce, Adrian, and Eldon to help me set the vessel in order. So could His Majesty grab a few of the remaining people and make a raft. Consider it done, Captain." "All look, tell them we should also dispose of old Bernie. I'm afraid, it said what it is tempting to just dump him in the sea. We probably should bury him." "Don't look at me," Gon said. "I didn't even know the man. I'll do it, Myron. Tell them, can someone help me get him to the beach?" "Good, now we're all squared away." Myron said, "We'll set sail in 6 hours. Hopefully." Chapter 13. The Voyage of the Harbinger. The tide had come in, and Arista noted most of the shore was gone. Waves slammed against the cliff edge, hammering the wall. Seawater sloushed in and out of the shaft. They'd come down, making a vague sucking sound with each roll out. The vessel sat upright, the deck flat, and the whole thing rocked with each new set of waves, which lifted the stern. Myron stood on the deck of the Harbinger, casting his eyes upward at the sails, as Royce flew about on ropes, tying off the braces, soaked to the bone. The monk created a puddle where he stood. His frock stuck to his skin. A bit of glowing seaweed was on his shoulder, and he had black sand in his hair and on his cheeks. "All done then?" Adrian inquired, tying the end of one of the lines Royce had dropped to him. Meyer nodded. "Well, mostly, but I thought..." He looked up once more. "I thought Royce might be willing to say a few words. Since he knew him best." "Royce is a bit busy," Adrian replied. Myron's shoulders slumped. "How about if I come? I knew him too." "Can I come?" Rist asked. She'd been on deck, coiling ropes and generally clearing the clutter. No one had inquired her to. No one had inquired her to do anything. Women were unexpected on board a ship, and she did not think quite knew what to do with her. She tried helping Ulrich with building the raft for the anchor, but that had gone badly. Her brother noticeably winced to each time she suggested something. To Marvin Deegan or Magnus, after only an hour she excused herself, saying she wasn't feeling well, and returned to the ship. She hoped Wyatt would have some use for her, but he only smiled and nodded politely as he passed. "Of course," Myron said eagerly, a smile brightening his face. Arista jumped to her feet, feeling oddly relieved. Somehow she'd expected Myron would exclude her as well. She regretted volunteering, as getting off the vessel required wading in chest-deep water. It was very cold and took her breath away. A robe billowed around her as she struggled to find traction in the ground below. Strong waves struck her from behind, and she started to fall face forward. Hadrian caught her by the elbow and held her up. "Thank you, I thought I was going for a swim there," she told him. "Bad form on the wave's part. Sneaking up and attacking you from the back like that. Not very chivalrous, was it? Not at all, I complain." Myron moved ahead of them, splashing his way to a high point where the water was only a few inches deep. "He's under here, but at least he used to be." Myron looked about concerned. "I'm sure he still is," Adrian said. "We'd best get started before he slips away," Arista said, as a wave as retreat sucked her feet into the sand. "You start us off, Myron. Dear Maribor, our eternal father. We are gathered here to say farewell to our brother. Bernie, that's his name, right?" Myron whispered. Adrian nodded. "We ask that you remember him and see that he crosses the river to the land of the dawn." He looked to Adrian, motioning with his hand for him to speak. Adrian thought a moment. Bernie wasn't a good man exactly. He was a thief and a grave robber, and he tried to knife Royce once. Seeing Myron's expression, Arista nudged Adrian, but he didn't actually ever try to kill any of us. He was just doing his job. I suppose he was pretty good at it. I didn't stop there looking awkward. Would you like to say something? Myron inquired Arista. I didn't know him. At this point, I don't think he'd mind, Myron said. Okay, I suppose. She thought a second, then said, although none of us knew him well, I'm certain Mr. Bernie had virtues, as well as shortcomings like any of us. He likely helped people, or showed courage in the face of adversity when others might not. He must have had some good in him, otherwise Maribor wouldn't have sent one of his most compassionate and thoughtful servants here to ensure he had a proper passing. Wow, that was much better than mine, Agent whispered she. Arista said, and so Lord Myron concluded with a bowhead, we say farewell to Bernie. May the light of a new dawn rise upon his soul. Then in a light voice Myron sang unto Maribor, I beseech thee into the hands of God. I send thee grant him peace, I beg thee give him rest. I ask thee may the God of men watch over your journey. Is that it? Agent asked. That's it, Myron replied. Thank you both for coming and standing in the cold water. Let's get back, my feet are going numb. Arista said, hopping through the surf. Your Highness, Myron asked. Chasing her, I can't help but ask, who is the servant of Maribor you were speaking of? She looked at him surprised. You, of course, oh. When they got back, Ulrich and the rest were tying up their makeshift raft. To the side of the Harbinger, Arista was impressed. The raft was 8 feet square, lashed tight and corked with pitch. On board, Wyatt and Eldon were pushing everything that could be moved, from the bow to the stern. The back of the vessel began to rock in earnest, making it hard to stand once everyone was on board. Wyatt looked up as if to the heavens and shouted, blows the topsail. She gasped as Royce pulled a line, then without hesitation, ran across the yard to the far side and pulled another. The topsail fell open, and Royce dropped to the masthead and running along the top of the mainsail yard. Tied off the sheets, loose the mainsail white charted, and Royce released the big sail, hands to the sheets. Adrian and Alden on opposite sides of the ship pulled ropes connected to the lower corners of the sail, stretching it out. Taut hands to the braces back all sails. Elgin and Hadrian seized hold of ropes attached to the ends of the yards and pulled, twisting them around so that they caught the wind on an angle, pushing the vessel backward toward the sea. They looked to Wyatt, who waved them over until they have the right angle. Then they tied off the braces, everyone to the stern. Wyatt called, and each of them moved to the back of the ship. The wind and the waves rocked them, and at times it seems they were lifting, but the vessel failed to move. The keels dug in wide, said inside, we need to catch off. Eldon and Hadrian, hoist the anchor to the raft and lash it tight. All right, forgive me, Your Majesty, but I need to use you like a deckhand, and will be dispensing with formalities. I hope you understand, please. Take Marvin and launch the raft as soon as the anchor is on it. Now this is what you must remember. Paddle out directly behind the ship. Any angle will reduce our traction. We want to pull the vessel in perfect line with the keel. When you're out so far that the chain is fully extended, drop the anchor, then return to the vessel as fast as you can. All right, nodded, and with Marvin following, they ascended over the side of the ship, using the pulleys attached to the main yard. Hadron and Eldon hoisted the anchor out over the raft, which bobbed and bucked in the surf. Beric and Marvin straddled it, tying the anchor fast to the deck. Both were sprayed and soaked by crashing waves. Adrian handed paddles down, and with one on each side, the two worked to push the weighted craft out over the swells. The chain played out through Wyatt's own hands as he stood at the stern, carefully watching their progress. Eric and Marvin appeared like two rats on a barrel lid. When the chain went toward, Arista saw the flash of Marvin's blade, and the anchor went into the water, nearly flipping the raft. Hands to the captain, Watt called. That's everyone except, of course, you, Your Highness, Arista sighed, but was just as happy to stand at the stern rail and watch Ulrich and Marvin, who were paddling back. They were moving much faster, now that they had the swells pushing them in the center of the ship. Poles were passed through the holes in the big wheel, and everyone put the weight into pushing the capstone around. Arista could hear the rapid clank, clank of the paws as they took up the slack. Then the sound grew slower, the time between clanks longer. Everyone aside from her, including Wyatt, eaved on the captain. Each pole had 2 people on it. Except for Eldon's, the giant commanded his own pole, and his face was turning red from the strain. Arista heard a fearful creaking as the anchor and the vessel fought each other. Show us the waves, Arista wife called to her. Put your arms up and drop them. Just before a wave is about to hit the ship, she nodded and looked out to sea. Ulrich and Marvin were already coming alongside. She looked at the swells. They were in a lull, but you could see 3 humps in the distance, rolling toward them like the slithering back of serpents. It'll be a minute, she shouted back. Everyone rest. Why? Tell them when you see her drop her arms. Really put your back into it. Marvin and Ulrich scrambled over the side. Soaked and exhausted, they flung themselves down on the deck. No time to rest, Wyatt shouted at them. Find a spot on the poles. The swells were nearing, and Arista raised her arms. Get ready. They all braced themselves and took deep breaths. The first swell rushed in, and Arista dropped her arms. But she did so too late. They heaved. There was a grinding sensation. Then it stopped, and the men fell exhausted, hanging from the poles. I timed it wrong, Arista shouted. I was too late. Here comes another. She raised her arms, and the old braced again. With Marvin and Ulrich finding places at the poles, Arista watched the swell rushing at her. This time she lowered her arms, while the wave was still a few feet away. By the time the men heaved, the rear of the vessel was rising. There were a noticeable lurch and more grinding. This time, she heard the sound of wood scraping and felt movement. One more, she shouted, raising her arms and then dropping them. Almost as soon as they were up, once more the man pushed. The chain tightened and the boat rose. This time a gust of wind managed to catch the topsail, and the vessel lurched dramatically. The bottom scraped and broke out of the sludge. They rocked smooth and free, drifting backward. A cheer rose and everyone was grinning. Wyatt ran back to the stern beside Arista and seized hold of the wheel. That was lucky, he said, sweat dripping from his forehead. Great job, by the way, thanks. Keep cranking, let's see if we can save the anchor. The men pushed the captain around easily. Now they quickly covered the distance. Ulrich and Marvin had paddled and passed it. Arista watched the cables swing down beneath them. There was a sudden lurch that staggered her. Then she heard the rapid clanking of the poles. As the anchor came in, "Man the braces," Wyatt shouted. "Stand by to come about." Wyatt looked out at the swells and gave the wheel a hard spin. The vessel turned. "Swing round the odds starboard tack." Everyone else cleared out of the way as Adrian, Eldon and Royce went to work, twisting the yards and tying off. The vessel turned its nose out to sea, and the wind filled the sails, pushing it over to one side. Tacks and sheets catch that wind. Arista seized hold of the rail, frightened at the sudden speed the vessel acquired, and the disturbing tilt of the deck, concerned that they were about to capsize. She watched apprehensively as the master leaned, and the vessel rode on its side. "There she goes," White exclaimed with a great smile on his lips. "Fly, Harbinger, fly." As if the vessel heard him, the bow broke through a crest, dove forward and hurtled the surface until it splashed down with a burst of spray. At a girl, Arista carried the hot cup. With difficulty she held it with both hands, but the deck refused to stay in one place for long and caused her to stagger. She approached Myron, who sat shivering, with his back against the base of the mast. "Here," she said, kneeling down and holding out the steaming cup for me. He inquired, and she nodded. He took the cup and sniffed. "It's tea," he said, as if the drink were some kind of miracle. "It's hot tea. You seemed like you could use something warm to drink." Myron looked at her with an expression of such gratefulness. She thought for a moment that he might cry. I don't know what to say, it's just tea, Myron." It wasn't much work. You had to get the stove going, and that must have been difficult. I wouldn't know how to do that on board a ship. I didn't use the stove. But you had to boil the water. "Oh," you said, lowering his voice. "Yeah, I used a little trick." She wiggled her fingers. He looked back down at the cup. "If you don't want it, that's okay. I just thought." He lifted the cup and took a noisy sip. "It's wonderful. Created by magic and made for me by a royal princess. This is the best tea I've ever had." "Thank you." She laughed a bit and sat down before the lurching of the vessel knocked her over. "Lately I sometimes forget I'm a princess. I haven't thought of myself that way for a really long time. Still, it is astoundingly thoughtful." "It's what I can do," she said. "I feel useless lately. The least I can do is cook. Problem is I really don't know how. But I can boil water like nobody's business. I'd like to make a cup of tea for Royce. Hagen says he gets seasick, and I always thought tea soothed the stomach. But he's up in the rigging still, at the rate we're traveling. I don't think it'll be much longer before we land." Myron tilted the cup to his lips and sipped. "It tastes wonderful. You did an excellent job." She smirked at him. "You'd say that even if it was awful." "I get the impression I could serve you dishwater, and you'd act perfectly happy." He nodded. "That's true, only I wouldn't be acting." She opened her mouth to protest, then stopped. "You really mean that, don't you?" He nodded and took another sip. "It doesn't take much to please you, does it, Myron?" Batten Boulard once wrote, "When you expect nothing from the world, not the light of the sun, the wet of water, nor the air to breathe, everything is a wonder and every moment a gift, and you expect nothing from the world." He looked at her puzzled. "I'm a monk." She smiled and nodded. "You need to teach me to be a monk. I expect too much, I want too much, things I can't have. Desire can be painful, but so can regret. That is the one thing I have too much of." Sailroy shouted from somewhere above them, where Wyatt called from the wheel, off the starboard bow. "You'll be able to see it in another minute." Arista and Myron got to their feet and moved to the rail. The dark prow of the Harbinger cut a white slice through the luminous green waves ahead. The city was much closer. Arista could see some detail in the building's windows, doorways, stairs, and domes. "Which side is the starboard side?" she asked. The right side, Myron told her, starboard, is derived from what they used to call the rudder, the steerboard, which was always on the right side of a ship because most people are right-handed. As a result, when docking, the one steering a vessel always pulled up, placing the opposite side of the vessel next to the pier, so it didn't interfere with this paddling or the rudder, and of course that side. The left side was the port side also, Hill McDaven explained in Chronicles of Maritime Commerce and Trade Practices of the Kilner Union. Adrian said you could do stuff like that, but until you see it, it's hard to believe. It's amazing that you can remember so many things. Everyone has talents, it's like magic, I guess. Yes, she said, slowly nodding. I suppose it is. Look, Myron told her, pointing. She spotted dark sails coming out of the dim light. They were far larger than their own, big sweeping triangles of black canvas, with a white mark emblazoned on them. The design was a symbol of slashes that looked vaguely like a skull. Everyone get down, watch out it. Royce, tell me if they change course toward us. Ariston Miron lay down on the deck, but continued to peer out at the approaching vessel. The hull came into view as if out of a green fog. It too was black and glistened with the ocean spray, looking like smoked glass, the underside reflecting the unholy glow of the sea. The vessel appeared ominous. It looked as if it was something not of their world at all. A light flashed from the top of the masts. "They're signaling us," Royce called down. "Damn, wife said that's going to be a problem. She's changing course toward us." Hands to the braces wired, shattered as he spun the wheel, and the Harbinger turned away from the oncoming ship. "They're onto us now." Arista heard a faint shout across the water, and she could see movement. Small dark figures loped across the deck. As she saw them, a chill ran through her. Like anyone she'd heard tales of, the Baron Gazelle, the sea goblins. They were the stuff of legends. Nora, Arista's nursemaid, had told her fairy stories at bedtime, most often. The tales were about greedy dwarves that kidnapped spoiled princesses, were always saved by a dashing prince in the end. But sometimes she spoke about the gazelle. No prince ever saved a princess from them, no matter how dashing. The gazelle were vile creatures of the dark, inhuman monsters, the children of a malevolent god. Nora's tales of the gazelle always included villagers burned, warriors killed, and children taken not to be ransomed, but to be feasted on. The gazelle always ate their victims. When Arista was sitting in her bed, wrapped in blankets, surrounded by pillows and safe, and the warmth and light of a crackling fireplace, Nora's tales were fun. She always imagined dwarves as nasty little men, and fairies as tiny winged girls, but the gazelle she could never conjure entirely. Even in the vast imaginings of her childish mind, they were always as they appeared now. Distant, threatening shadows exhibiting fast, jerky movements that no human could make. Nora had always begun her stories the same way. Not all of this story is true, but enough is. Looking out at the ship and the dark figures on the deck, Arista wondered if Nora had realized just how true they were. The Harbinger pivoted under Wyatt's left hand, shearing away to the left. Aristern Miron lost sight of the gazelle ship. They ran back to the stern, where Wyatt stood holding the wheel with one hand. While looking back over his shoulder, the gazelle vessel had matched to their attack and was coming up on their stern. Everyone to the lee side. "Oh, now which side is that?" Arista inquired Myron, opposite of windward. Right now it's the starboard side." What in Mariber's name is wrong with left and right? As soon as they reached the starboard rail, she knew why Wired had ordered them there. As he cranked the wheel, the wind pressed the Harbinger's sails and bent the vessel over on its beam, forcing it dangerously close to capsizing. The starboard side rose higher and higher. Arista wrapped her arms around the rail to keep from sliding, and Myron did the same, farther up the deck. Magnus looked terrified as he clutched the side. his feet skidding and slipping on the wet boards. If the vessel had flown before, it was doing something unheard of now. They no longer dipped and rose, but like a bar of soap running across a washboard, they hammered the crests as they went. The vessel felt like a stone being skipped across a lake. "Ha ha." Wired cheered the wind, ripping the words from his mouth so that she barely heard him. "Match that with your overweight throw." She watched Wyatt, with his feet in place against the stock, his arms holding the wheel, hugging it to his chest like a lover, his hair blowing, the spray bathing him. He wore a grin, and she wasn't certain whether she should be happy or concerned. The rest of them hung on in desperation as the race sent them across the luminous sea. Arista noticed the pain in her arm lessening, the vessel righting itself, their speed dropping. She glanced at Wyatt and saw a look of concern. "They're stealing our wind," he grumbled. "How are they doing that?" Oric asked. "They're putting us in their wind shadow, moving their vessel in line with ours blocking it, depriving us, and still the brace's starboard tack." The vessel was nearly flat now, allowing Hadrian and Eldon to run. They cast off ropes and pulled the yard around again, the big sail flapping as wired. Turned the vessel to catch the wind from the other side. Overhead, Royce moved among the top lines, working the upper sail, all those sheets in. They caught the wind once more, and the vessel set off again, all hands to part. Arista was ahead of him already, running across the deck to renew her grip on the rail. She knew what was coming this time and got her feet planted securely. Before the side of the vessel rose, beyond the stern she could see the following ship, already turning to mimic their action, the great black sails with the skull-like symbols. Flapping loose as they came around, they were much closer now. She could clearly see the creatures, crawling across the deck, climbing ropes. Dozens of them had gathered near the bow. It frightened her to see them move. They skidded along on all fours like spiders. A shipload of huge black tarantulas so tightly packed. They ascended over each other just to move about. The harbingers skipped the waves again, racing directly at the city, but it was no use. The following vessel, with its larger bank of sails, was still eating up the distance between them and moved to cut their wind again. Ellen Adrian White called, "I will be going back, but when I do, I will then change my mind and go back to my previous talk. Do you understand? The moment you get my signal, run the gym up to port." Adrian looked at Eldon, who is nodding. "Show him, Eldon. This has to go perfectly. I were dead in the water. Also get all Rick and Marvin on the lines. More hands will make this easier. The moment we are back on tack and underway, drop the jib. Let's see how good that crew is. They have the advantage of more canvas, so let's turn that against them. With all that sail, it'll take them longer to recover. And if they don't pull back in time, they will stall. Your Highness," he said, addressing Arista, "I will need to be facing forward to time this just right, so you need to be my eyes. Astern, I need you to watch the Gazelle ship and tell me the moment you see them starting to come around. Got that?" "Yes," she replied, nodding in case her feeble voice was lost in the wind. "Then get forward and hang on." She nodded again and began crawling to the front of the ship, moving hand over hand along the rail. "Stand by to come about," Wyatt shouted. He waited. She watched as the Gazelle vessel once more glided over, aligning itself, eclipsing their wind. Wyatt flexed his fingers on the wheel and took a deep breath, even closed his eyes for a moment, perhaps saying a silent prayer. Then he stiffened his back and turned the wheel hard over. The vessel sheered back to port, tacks and sheets. Eldon and Hadron went to work once more, and Morven and Ulrich followed their directions, pulling the yards round. Arista focused her gaze on the Gazelle vessel behind them. She could feel the Harbinger shifting, sensed it slowing underneath her. As it started to lose the wind, they're turning. She shouted as she saw the Gazelle coming about, the tiny, Spiders scattered across their deck in sudden fury. They were not just trying to match their turn. They were trying to beat them to it. Wyatt did nothing. "They're turning," she yelled again. "I heard you," he said. "We need to wait for them to be fully committed." Arista gripped the rail with nervous hands, feeling the vessel moving slower and slower. Avasti finally shouted back. All braces raised the jib. The vessel still had some wind, still some forward motion to it, and when Wired turned the wheel, it responded. The jab out front had the angle and caught what was left of the wind. Turning the bow, a wave caught them dead on and broke, washing the deck, but the vessel held true. The sails caught the wind and filled. Eldon hauled down the jib as once more the Harbinger flew behind them. The Gazelle realized their mistake, but were too late. They tried to mimic the turn, and she watched as their sails went slack. Wyatt looked behind them. They're lost. Stalled in the eye of the wind, he declared, grinning, his chest heaving with excitement. It'll take them several minutes to catch it again. By then we will sail, Royce shouted. Stop it now. Wyatt's green melted as his head turned. Ahead of them appeared a vessel that looked nearly identical to the one behind. It flashed a light, and behind them, the other Gazelle vessel replied. Wyatt looked fore and aft, and she could see the story written clearly in lines of fear on his face. Through great skill and a bit of luck, they barely managed to avoid one ship. They would not fare well against two. Sail portbow was shattered, and she could see Wide visibly slump against the wheel, as if struck from behind, widely off the wheel, and let the vessel slow and level off. There was no need to hasten their approach. Everyone on board looked to him. What now? Auric asked, coming after. Wyatt didn't reply. He just turned his head, looking back and forth of the ships. His forehead glistened. He bit his lip, and Arista noticed his left hand starting to shake. We're out of options, aren't we? Auric asked. This vessel doesn't even have nets to impede boarders. White replied. How will they attack? Hedron asked. Will they board? Eventually, yes, but first they will clear the deck with arrows. Fire. No, White replied. They have us. We're boxed and overwhelmed. They will want the ship. Do we have to surrender? Auric asked. Gazelle don't take prisoners, Adrian told him. They don't even have a word in the language for surrender. What do we do then? The king asked. We don't really have a lot of options, Your Majesty. Why? I told him those ships hold 60, maybe as many as 100 Gazelle each, and we don't even have a means of shooting back. Their archers will drive us into the cabin. Then they will grapple on and come aboard uncontested. At that point, they could lock us in and sail us to their port, which they will do. Patron added. Then they'll drag us into a ring and end well. You get the idea. No sense in spoiling the surprise. I hate ships, Magnus crowd infernal things. There's nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. We're going to die. God inquired, stunned. I can't die. I'm going to be emperor. Yeah, well, we all had plans, didn't we? Adrian said. I didn't. Royce said, climbing down from the rigging. Arista noted a modest smile on his lips. I don't think I'll be joining you in the cabin. I don't mind a game of arrow dodging. Actually, only Arist and Myron should go in the cabin. Adrian said. The rest of us will remain on deck. We'll need shield. Anything of wood about an inch thick will do, or metal even thinner. Tryons don't have much penetration power. We can also use the mask as cover. Arista looked out of the approaching ships, coming at angles to intercept them. The Bar-Ren Gazelle were coming, and there would be no rescue by a dashing prince. The Gazelle always ate their victims, not this time, she told herself, and letting go of the rail, she walked forward. She stepped around Wide at the wheel and passed through the group of men. In the waist, Arista. Adrian called. You should get in the cabin. She looked out at the water. Mr. Dementhal, she shouted. Take hold of that wheel, everyone else. Hang on to something. Taking a breath, Arista calmed herself and reached out into the dark, into the energy that lay around them, above and below. She could feel the depths of the ocean, the weights of the water, the floor of the sea, the fish, the seaweed, the glowing algae. She felt the breeze and seized it tight, the wind which had been a constant presence since they had ascended out of the shaft to the beach. Abruptly died, the sails drooped, the incessant, quivering clank of pulleys and ropes halted. Not a breath remained, and the world became silent. Even the waves perished, the ship stopped. As the sea became as tranquil as a bathtub, the silence was deafening. Then across the water, the hush was broken by gazelle voices. She could hear them like the barks and howls of dogs. She felt them too. She felt everything and held it all in her grip. She raised her hand, holding her fingertips slightly. Fire, she thought she'd played that note before. She knew just how to do it. But as enticing as the thought of 3 flaming pies against the water was, the light would alert to the shore wind. She could sense that chord. It was powerful. She could shatter the ships, no too unwieldy, like trying to pick up a coin with mittens. Water. Yes, it was everywhere. She twisted 3 fingers in the air, and the world responded with movement. The sea swirled, currents formed, churning, building, rotating and spinning. The 3 gazelle ships began to rotate, revolving as if they were toy boats in a tub shed. Flicked with a finger, whirlpools formed beneath the goblin ships. Circles appeared, large swirling funnels of spinning water. Faster and faster they moved, the centers giving way, dropping lower as the speed of the rotation increased. They widened, spreading out, and grew in strength. Even the Harbinger began to rock noticeably as the maelstroms reached out to pull on the strength of the whole sea. The barks of the gazelle became cries and screams as the ships continued to spin. A crack issued across the water as a mast snapped, then another and another. Poles the size of tree trunks popped like twigs. The gazelle shrieked and wailed, the voices blurring into one note, which Arista also held. The sheer enormity of the power she worked was incredible. It was so easy and all at her command. Everything, every drop, that every breath, every heartbeat, it was all hers. She felt them, touched them, played with them. It was irresistible, like scratching a terrible itch. She let the power run. It was so big, so potent. She didn't just control the power, she was the power, and it was her. She whirled, she frothed, and she wanted to run, to spin and grow like a ball sent off a hill. She felt the building momentum. It excited her, and she loved the motion, the freedom. She felt herself letting go, giving herself to it, spreading out and becoming a part of the symphony. She played so grand, so beautiful. All she wanted was to blend with the whole, to become. Stop it. The idea was discord. An off note, a broken thread. Stop it, pull back. A distant voice called her, struggling to be heard. Over the crescendo of the music she played. Regain control. She didn't want to listen. She didn't like the sound. It clashed with the melody. You're killing them. Of course I'm killing them. That's the whole point. The gazelle are gone. That is not who you are killing. Stop. No, I can't. You can. I won't. I don't want to do. It's too wonderful to stop. Too incredible. I have to keep going. I love it so. Arista woke with a wrenching headache. It was so painful her eyes hurt just from opening. She was in the cabin, lying on the bed where they had found Bernie. A lantern hanging from a hook on the ceiling swayed back and forth, casting shadows that slashed from one wall to the next. She turned her head and pain swelled behind her eyes. Oh, she whispered. Arista raised her hand and found a bandage wrapped around her head. There was stiffness at the back of her head, with the bandage pulled at her hair. Drawing her hand away, she found blood on her fingertips. Are you all right? Myron asked. He sat beside her on a little stool and took her hand in his. What happened? She asked. My head is killing me. Excuse me a moment, the monk said and opened the door to the deck. She's awake, he called. Immediately Hadrian and Ulrich entered, ducking inside and dodging the lantern. Are you all right? Why does everyone keep asking me that? And yes, I'm splendid mostly, but my head hurts. She sat up slowly. Adrian looked pained. I'm sorry about that. She narrowed her eyes at him, which made her head hurt even more. You hit me, he nodded. Why he had to barrack put in his expression grave you. You lost control or something. What do you mean? Arista saw him glance toward the doorway. What is it? What happened? She stood up weaving a bit. Her head still not right, and she felt tired to the point of being groggy. Agent extended her hand and steadied her. She ducked her head, careful to avoid banging it against the door frame, and stepped out onto the deck. Oh dear Maribor, she gasped. The Harbinger was in shambles. The mask was gone. All that remained was a splintered stump. The beams of the deck were warped. One board was cracked to the point of splintering, and on the starboard side, near the bow, there was a gaping hole that revealed the hull below. The top sail was gone, along with the top sail yard, but the main sail lay across the bow, torn and tattered. The railing on the port side was missing as well. Sheared away. I did this, she inquired, shocked. Oh my, is anyone? She looked around searching for faces. Gaunt Magnus Morven, Ulrich Hedron. Where's Roy Squared and Eldon? They're okay, they're working on the ship. Everyone's okay, Oleg told her. Thanks to Adrian we tried talking to you. Shaking you white, even poured water over your head. You just stood there, mumbling and fiddling with your fingers, while the vessel came apart. Marvin was smiling at her and nodding. On his forehead, a deep cut stood out and his cheek was red and blotchy. Did I do that? Actually, a flying pulley did that. I was just too stupid to duck. You still smiling at her. But there was something behind it. Something terrible. Something she had never seen on Marvin's face before. Fear. Fear of her. She sat down where she was, feeling the strength melt out of her legs. I'm so sorry, she whispered. It's all right, her brother told her again. With apprehension in his voice, they made a circle around her. But no one came near. I'm sorry, she repeated, her eyes filled with tears, and she let them run down her cheeks. I just wanted. The voice gave up on her, and she began to weep. There's nothing to be sorry for, Adrian said. He came forward and knelt beside her. You saved us, the Gazelle are gone. Yeah, Marvin said. Scariest thing I've ever seen. It was like what they said Ezra Hardin could do. Only he never did. It was what we needed. Adrian broke in over him. If she hadn't, we'd all be dead now. And trust me, it would have been a very unpleasant death. Thank you, Your Highness. She looked up at Adrian. He appeared blurry through her watering eyes. He was smiling. She wiped her face and appeared at him again carefully. She studied his eyes. What he asked? Nothing, she said. His hand reached out and brushed her cheeks dry. What he inquired again? I don't want. She hesitated and took a breath. I just don't want people to be afraid of me. That arrow's already flown. Dagon Gone said. Shut it, cunt, or Rick snapped. Look at me, Adrian told her. And putting his hand under her chin, he gently lifted it. He took her hands in his. Do I look frightened? No, she said, but maybe you should be. You're tired. I am. I'm really very tired. We're going to be drifting here for a bit, so why don't you lie down and get some rest? I'm sure things will look better when you wake up. She nodded and her head felt like a boulder, rocking on her shoulders. Come on, he said, pulling her to her feet. She wavered and he slipped an arm around her waist and escorted her back into the cabin, where Myron had the bed ready. Myron will watch over you, Adrin assured Arista, as he tucked the blankets tightly around her. Get some sleep, thank you. He brushed her wet hair from her eyes. It's the least I can do for my hero, he said. She walked swiftly up the Grand Mar, the broad avenue beautifully lined with flowering trees. The rose-colored petals flew and swirled, carpeting the ground, scenting the air and creating a blizzard in spring. It was festival day, and blue and green flags were everywhere. They flew over houses and waved in the hands of passers-by. People clogged the street, Wandering minstrels filled the air with music and song. Drums announced another parade, this one a procession of elephants, followed by chariots, prancing horses, dancing women, and proud soldiers. Storekeepers called to the crowd, handing out cakes, nuts, confections, and fermented drinks called trembles. Made from sweet blossoms of the trees, young girls rushed from door to door, delivering small bouquets of flowers in the imperial colors. Noblemen on their chariots wore their bright-colored tunics. Gold bracelets flashed in the afternoon sun. Older women stood on balconies, waving colored scarves and shouting words impossible to hear. Boys who dodged and slipped through the crowd carried baskets and sold trinkets. You could get 3 copper pins for 3 piths, or 5 for a king. There was always a contest too. Collect the largest variety of pins. Before the day was out, it was a beautiful day. She hurried past the rivers of people into Imperial Square. To her right stood the stone rotunda of the Sensorium, and to the left the more brutish, columned facade of the blocked hall of Teschler. Before her, at the terminus of the boulevard, rose the great golden-domed Imperial Palace, the seat of the Emperor of the world. She walked past the Elorium Fountain, across the Memorial Green, to the very steps of the palace. Not a single guard was on duty. No one noticed. Everyone was too busy celebrating. That was part of the plan that Venlin had laid well. She entered the marbled hall, so cool, so elegant, and scented with incense. That made her think of tropical trees and mountain tops. The palace was a marvel, large, beautiful, and so sturdy. It was hard to imagine what she knew was happening. She reached the long gallery, the arcade of storied columns, each topped with 3 lions, looking down from their noble perch at all who passed that way. Ulrich was waiting for her. The old man leaned heavily on his staff. His long white beard was a matted mess. "So you have come," he greeted her. "But I knew you what I knew someone would. I could have guessed it would be you. This is wrong. You of all people should see that." Yarrick shook his head. "Wrong. Write these words. Have no meanings except in the minds of men. There are but illusions. There is only what is and what isn't. What has been and what will be. I am here to define that value for you. I know you are. I could have predicted it. My suspicions, it would seem, have weight. This is the 2nd time now. It has taken a long time to find. But there is a pattern to the world. Wobble it and it corrects, which should be impossible. Chaos should beget chaos. Order should be only one possibility, and drowned by all the other permutations. But if it corrects again, if order prevails, then there can be only one answer. There's another force at work, an invisible hand. And I think I know what that force is. I don't have time to discuss this theory of yours again. Nor do I have need of you. As I said, I have finally worked it out. You see, the legends are true. She was irritated with him. He barred her path but didn't attack. He merely babbled on about unimportant theories. This was no time for metaphysical debates about the nature of existence. Chaos versus order, or the values of good and evil. She needed to get by him, but Yarrick was the one person she could not hope to defeat. She couldn't take the chance of instigating a battle. If it could be avoided, do you side with Fenlin or not? Side with the bishop? No. She felt a massive sense of relief. Will you help me? Together we could stop him. Together we can save the Emperor, save the Empire. I wouldn't need your help to do that. So you will let it happen? Of course. Hi, I need the wobble. One does not a pattern make. I need to see if it will correct again, and perhaps how. I must find the fingerprint, the tracks that I can trace to the source. The legends are true, I know that now, but I still want to see his face. I don't know what you're talking about. I know you don't. You couldn't. Are you going to try and stop me or not? The wobble, my boy, I never touch it once I have it going. You go do what you must. I am only here now to watch, to see if I can catch a glimpse of the face. Behind the invisible hand, she was confused, baffled by Ulrich's unconcerned attitude. But it did not matter. What did was that he would not interfere. A greatest obstacle was gone. Now it was just between her and Venlin. Goodbye then, old master. But I fear I shall never see you again. No, you won't. I would wish you luck, but I do not believe it exists. Still, I suspect you have better than mere luck on your side. You have the invisible hand. Chapter 14, The Cold. The ceiling of the Grand Imperial throne room was a dome, painted to mimic the sky on the gentle summer's day. And Medina still thought it beautiful, dressed once more in her formal gown. She sat on the gaudy bird of prey throne, with the wings spread into a vast half-circle. Forming the back of the chair, the throne was mounted on a dais that had 12 steps to climb. She couldn't help remembering the days they had forced her to practice before it. Do you remember the board you ordered? Sewn into my dress, she inquired Nimbus, who looked suddenly uncomfortable. It worked, he replied. Who's next? Members studied the parchment in his hands. Bernard Green, the candle maker from Alburn. Send him in and get another log on the fire. It's freezing in here. Unlike the Great Hall, the throne room was rarely used. Or at least that had been the case until now, when the Empress had been a mythical creature. The room had been sealed, now that she existed in the flesh. The room was opened once more, but always felt cold, as if it would take time to recover the warmth. After those years of neglect, Nimbus waved to the clerk, and a moment later a short, soft-looking man ended. His eyes were small, his nose narrow and sharp. Medina immediately thought of a squirrel and recalled how she used to remember the court of Ethelwood by similar associations. Before she learned their names, Your Grand Imperial Eminence, he said with a shaky voice and bowed so low. His forehead touched the floor. They all waited. He did not move. Please stand up, she told him. The man popped up like a child's toy, but he refused to look at her. They all did that. She found it irritating, but understood it was a tradition, and it would even be more unnerving for them to try to change. Speak, a Grand Imperial Eminence. That is, I am from Alban, and I am a candle maker. Yes, I know that. But what is your problem, will your Grand Imperial Eminence? Since the edict, I have moved my family here. But you see, I have little means and no skills other than making candles. But the Merchant Guild refuses to grant me a license of business. I am told that I cannot have one as I'm not a citizen. Of course, Nimbus said, citizenship is a prerequisite for applying to a guild, and only guild members are allowed to conduct a trade within the city. How does one obtain citizenship? Medina asked. Usually by inheritance, although it can be granted to individuals or families as recognition for some extraordinary service. Regardless, one must be a member of a guild to gain citizenship. But if you need to be a guild member to apply for citizenship, and you need to be a citizen to be a guild member, doesn't that make it extraordinarily difficult to become a citizen? I believe that is the point. Your Eminence city is guard against invasions from outside tradesmen that might disrupt the order of established merchants and reduce the profitability of existing businesses. How many citizens are there at present? I believe about 10 to 15% of the city's population are citizens. That's ridiculous. Yes, your evidence. It's also a drain on the treasury, because only citizens are required to pay taxes. Also, only citizens have the right of a trial in a court, or are required to serve to protect the city walls in the event of attack. Medina stared at him. Shall I summon the city's merchant council and organize a meeting in order to review the guild policy? Say tomorrow, Nimbus asked. Please do. She looked back down at Bernard Green. Rest assured, I will address this matter immediately, and thank you for bringing it to my attention. Bless you, your Grand Imperial Eminence. Bless you. He bowed once more with his head to the floor. Medina waved her hand, and the Master-at-Arms escorted him out. I don't so much mind the bowing. That's actually nice. It's the scraping I can't stand. "You're not just the Empress," Nimbus told her. "You are a demigod. You must expect a little scraping. Who's next?" "A fellow by the name of Topin Twistle." "A scout from the north," he replied. "A scout? A scout follows the Candlemaker. He just has a status report. Nothing urgent," Nimbus told her. And the Candlemaker had been waiting for 3 days. A stocky man entered wearing a heavy wool tunic, with a little copper pin in the shape of a torch on his breast. He also spotted wool pants wrapped in leather strips. His face was blotchy, his skin a ruddy leather. The tip of his nose was more than red. It was a disturbing shade of purple. His knuckles and the tips of his fingers were a similar color. He walked with an unusual gait, a hobbled limp as if his feet were sore. "Your Imperial evidence." The man bowed and sniffled. "So Marshal Breckton sends word," he reports, "that there has been no confirmed movement by the elves since the initial crossing. In addition, he sends words that all bridges and roads have been closed. As for the lack of movement on the part of the elven force, it is his estimated opinion that the elves may have gone into winter quarters. He has also said several quartermaster lists and a detailed report which I have here in this satchel. You can give those to the clerk," Nimbus told him. He slipped the satchel off and sneezed as he held out the bag. "And how are things in Kalnara?" "Excuse me, Your Highness." He stuck a finger in his ear and wiggled it. "I've been fighting a cold for a month, and my head is so clogged I can barely hear." I inquired, "How are things in Kalnara?" She said louder, "They're fired in cold or up. It's the road between that gets a tide chilly. Of course I can't complain. I've been up on the line in the wilderness, and there it's colder than anything. Not even a proper fire allowed, but I kind of, not wanting to give away our positions to the owls. Is there anything you need me?" "No, I don't need much. I already had me a good hot meal and a sit near one half. That's all I need, course. A soft warm place to sleep a while before I head back would certainly be appreciated." Medina looked at numbers. "I would inform the Chamberlain," he told her. "Thank you, Your Evidence," the scout said and bowed again before leaving. "I never really thought about how it must be out there for them waiting," Medina said. "Next is Abner Galsworth, the city administrator," Nimbus said, and a tall, thin man entered. He was the best dressed of the lot that morning, wearing long, heavy robes of green and gold, draped nearly to the floor. On his head was a tall hat, with flaps that drooped down the sides of his head. Like a hound's ears, his face was long and narrow, qualities made more noticeable by the sagging of age. "Your Imperial Evidence." He bowed, but more shallowly than anyone else so far. "And there was no scraping to be seen, while I am pleased to report that all the provisioning you have commanded has been achieved, and that the city is functioning at high efficiency. I nevertheless regret to tell you that there is a problem. We are becoming overcrowded. Refugees are still arriving from the surrounding towns, and villages even more so, since the news of troops sealing the roads and passes has leaked into the countryside. We now have several hundred people living on the streets, and with the windows cold, I have daily reports coming across my desk of frozen corpses in need of disposal. At present, we are cutting the bodies outside the walls and piling them in a fallow field to await the spring burial. This solution, however, has attracted wild animals. Packs of wolves have been reported, and those still outside the city walls are complaining. I would like to request permission to dispose of the bodies at sea. To do this, I will require access to a barge. As all ships are presently under Imperial edict, my request has been repeatedly denied. Hence I'm here appealing to you, I see," Medina said. "And what provisions have you made to prevent the future deaths of more refugees?" "Provisions?" he inquired. "Yes. What have you done to stop the peasants from freezing to death?" "Why, nothing. The peasants are dying because we have no shelter. They have no shelter because they cannot afford any, or none can be found. I can either create money nor construct housing. Therefore, I do not understand your question. You cannot commandeer ships to dispose of bottas either. And yet you stand before me requesting that. True, but a barge is an achievable goal. Preventing future peasants from dying is not. The city has been overcrowded for weeks, and yet just this morning, another large group has arrived from Alban. There are perhaps 50 families. If a viable solution is what you desire, I suggest preventing any more displaced people from entering the city. Seal it off and be done with it. Let those that come here looking for charity learn that they must provide for themselves along them. Entry will only cause a higher rate of mortality. I suspect you are right, Medina told him. I also suspect you would feel quite differently if it was you and your family standing on the other side of our locked gate. I am the empress of all the people. It is my responsibility to keep them safe, not the other way around. Then please tell me what you would like me to do, for I can see no solution to this problem. There is simply no place for all these people. Medina looked around her. At the painted dome and the great stone heart burning. The new log she had ordered. Chancellor, she said. Yes, your evidence, Nimbus replied. How many people could we fit in this hall? He raised his eyebrows in surprise, then pursed his lips. Perhaps 100 if we don't mind squeezing together. I think if faced with freezing to death, they'll not mind. You will open the throne room to the public. Gosworth inquired, stunned. How will you conduct the business of the Empire? This is the business of the Empire. And no, I am not going to open the throne room to the public. She looked at numbers. I am opening the entire palace. I want the gates opened at once, lining the hall's corridors. Even the chapel, I want every square inch used. There will not be a single man, woman, or child left in the cold, as long as there is any room to spare. Is that understood? Absolutely, Your Eminence. Furthermore, she said, turning to Galsworth, I want a study done of the city, to locate any other sources of shelter that could be utilized. I don't care how hallowed or privileged. This is an emergency, and all spaces to be used. You're serious? He said, amazed. I will not have my people dying on my doorstep, she declared, and raised voice that left no room for question. Guards looked up, concerned by her unusual outburst. Servants appeared nervous, and several noticeably cringed. The city administrator did not. He remained straight, his eyes focused on her own. He said nothing for a moment, then his lips began to move about, as if he was sucking on something. And finally he began to nod. Very well, he said. I will begin to look into the matter, but I can tell you right now where there is a large, unused space. The Imperial Basilica of Equesta has the capacity to house perhaps 1,000, and at present is home to no more than 8 individuals. If you knew this, why did you not say something before? I would never presume to fill the house of God with poor filthy peasants. Then what in Mariber's name is it? For the Patriarch will not be pleased. Damn the Patriarch, Medina barked. Nimbus, that wants Your Eminence. Why are the two of you not asleep? Medina asked, entering her bedroom to find Mercy and Ali wide awake. Medina insisted that Ali stay in her room, as part of her initiative to free up as much space as possible. When Ali inquired for Mercy to join them, Medina couldn't refuse. Now both girls were in their nightgowns, wrapped in blankets, facing the darkened frost-covered window. At her question, the girls looked at her and then quickly wiped their cheeks. Too cold, Mercy responded unconvincingly, then sniffled. It's freezing, Ali agreed. They couldn't even play outside today. Even Mr. Rings won't set foot out there. Mercy glanced to where the raccoon was, curled up near the fire. It is very cold, isn't it? Medina said, looking out the window at the starry sky. The night was always clear when the temperature was frigid. It freezes the water in your eyes. It makes my ears hurt. Medina put her hand to the frosted glass, the same window she had spent so many hours kneeling before. It was like ice to her touch. Yes, the cold is troublesome, but it might just be the miracle we need. We needed to be cold, Ollie questioned. Well, if Mr. Rings won't go outside, I don't suspect anyone else will want to be out either. You mean the owls? Mercy asked. Yes, she replied. She didn't see the point in lying. Why do they want to kill us? Ollie is an elf, but she doesn't want to kill us, do you? Ollie shook her head. I don't know why. Medina said, I'm not certain anyone knows. The reason is likely very old, too old for anyone to remember. Will they? Will they kill us when it gets warmer? Ollie asked. I'm not going to let them. Your father isn't going to let them either. Is that why you were crying? You miss him, don't you? The girl nodded. And you? Medina looked at Mercy. I miss Arcadia and Miranda. She used to put me to bed at night. And he would tell me stories when I couldn't sleep. Well, I think I can help with that. I know a story that a dear friend once told me. When I was feeling very bad, so bad in fact, that I couldn't even eat. How about we get more wood for the fire, curl up in my big bed, and I'll tell it to you. She watched the two padding about in their bare feet. Collecting armloads of split logs, the Empress smiled. Everyone commented on how gracious she was for taking them in and sharing her personal chambers, although there were some who thought that it was a political ploy, that our generosity was extended to make it impossible for any Juke to suggest such indignities were beneath them. This wasn't the reason. Only a convenient secondary benefit. Medina did it because she had promised Wild she would look after Ollie, and she meant to fulfill that oath, as there was no separating the two girls. Medina inherited twins. Having done so, she realized that even if Wyatt returned that night, and the winter melted to summer, and all the problems with her kingdom were swept away, by some miracle, she would still want the children to live with her. Carefree laughter was something Medina had not heard in a great while. She had stared at a window, at a free blue sky, to avoid the gray world of grim-faced men. Now a bit of that sky bounced within her chambers. They reminded her of Maria and Jesse Coswell. Childhood friends were died too soon. She took the girls in and laid beside Ollie, stroking her hair. This is called Kyle and the White Feather. The father of the gods Erebus had 3 sons, Pharaoh, Jerome, and Meribur. They were the gods of elves, dwarves, and men. He also had a daughter, Muriel, who was the loveliest being ever created. She held dominion over all the plants and animals. Well, one night Erebus became drunk and, well, he hurt his own daughter. In anger, her brothers attacked their father and tried to kill him, but of course gods can't die. Filled with guilt and grief, Erebus returned to Muriel and begged her forgiveness. She was moved by her father's remorse, but still couldn't bear to look at him. He begged, pleading for her to name a punishment. He would do anything to win her forgiveness. Muriel needed time to let the fear and pain pass. So she told him, go to a land to live not as a god, but as a man, to learn humility, to repent for his misdeeds. She charged him with doing good works. Erebus did as she requested and took the name of Kyle. It is said that to this day, he walks the world of men working miracles. For each act that pleases her, Muriel bestows upon him a white feather from her magnificent robe, which he keeps in a pouch forever by his side. Muriel decreed that when the day came, when all the feathers were bestowed, she would call her father home and forgive him. It is said when all the gods are reunited, all will be made right, and the world will transform into a paradise. Empress Mercy said, yes, when you die, do you meet others who have died? I don't know. Who is it you want to meet? I miss my mother. Oh, that's different. She told her, I am quite certain. Daughters and mothers are always reunited. Really? Of course. She was very pretty, my mother. She used to say I was pretty too, and you are, she told me. I would grow up to be a fairy princess one day, but I don't think I will now. I don't think I will grow up at all. Don't talk like that. If your mother said you would be a fairy princess, you trust your mothers know these things. She hugged the girl and kissed her cheek. Mercy felt so small, so delicate. Now it's late and time for you to go to sleep." A bright moon was rising. Medina thought of the 58 men outside, pitched on a snowy hillside, ordered by her to remain in the cold. Some would lose fingers, others toes, noses or ears, and some might be dying right then. Like a father almost had the night of the blizzard, they might be huddled in a shallow, frozen hole they had chipped out of the snow, trying in vain to keep warm, with only a thin, wool blanket and a few layers of clothes, separating them from the bitter winds. They would shiver uncontrollably, the teeth chattering, the muscles tight as they pulled into balls, snow and ice forming on their beards and eyelashes. The unlucky ones would fall into a deep, warm sleep, never to wake up. She thought of the men, imagined to their pain and fear, and felt guilt. They were dying on her command, but she needed them to be there. As much as she wished it could be better for them, as much as she wished she could pray for warmer weather, she looked out at the sparkling stars and whispered, "Please, Maribor, I know I am not your daughter. I am but a poor peasant girl who shouldn't even be here. But please, please make it stay cold." She fell asleep and woke a few hours later. The room was dark, the new logs having burnt low and everything outside. The covers felt chilled. It was Mercy who had woken her. She was kicking and twisting on the covers. Her eyes still closed, she wrestled, her arms twitching, her eyes darting fretfully onto her lids. From her mouth came fearful utterances, like the cries of terror from one gagged. "What's wrong with her?" Ollie inquired with a sleepy face and matted hair. "Bad dream, I suspect." Medina took hold of Mercy's shoulder and gave it a gentle squeeze. "Mercy," she said. "Mercy, wake up." The little girl kicked once more, then lay still. Her eyes flooded open and then shifted left and right, nervously. "It's okay. It was just a bad dream." Mercy clutched to Medina, shaking. "It's all right, everything is okay now." "No," the little girl responded with a hitching voice. "It's not. I saw them. I saw the elves coming into the city. Nothing stopped them." Medina patted her head. "It was just a dream. A nightmare brought on because of what we were saying. Just before you fell asleep, I told you I won't let them hurt us. But you couldn't stop them. No one could." The walls fell down, and flying monsters burned the houses. I heard the men screaming in the fog. There was lightning, the ground broke, and the walls fell. They poured in riding white horses, all dressed in gold and blue. "Gold and blue?" Medina asked. She nodded. Medina's heart felt as if it skipped a beat. "Did you see the elves when you escaped the university?" "No, just the flying monsters. They were really scary." "How did you know they dressed in gold and blue?" "I saw them in my dream." "What else did you see?" "Which way do they come?" "I don't know. You said they were on horses." "Did they arrive here on horses or did they come by boat?" "I don't know. I just saw them on horses coming into the city." "Do you know which gate?" She shook her head, looking more frightened. As if Medina quizzed her, the Empress tried to calm down, tried to smile, but she could not. Instead, she stood up. The floor was cold, but she barely noticed. She paced, thinking, "It's not possible for a child to see the future. In a dream, is it?" But that's what the patriarch said when he was quoting at the meeting. They came on brilliant white horses, wearing shining gold and shimmering blue. Still, that ancient account might not apply to these owls. "Can you remember where you were when you saw the mandar of the gate?" Mercy thought a moment. "We were on the war out front of the courtyard, where Ollie and I play with Mr. Rings." "Was it day or night?" "Morning." "Could you see the sun?" She shook her head and Medina sighed. If only she. It was cloudy, Mercy told her. "Could you tell which side the sea was on?" While looking at the gate. This side, I think," she said, taking her right hand out of the covers and shaking it for her. "Are you sure?" The girl nodded. "You were looking at the southern gate," Medina said. "You to get back to sleep," she told the girls, and left them staring as she rushed out of the bedroom. Pulling on a robe, the guard outside spun around, startled. Wake up the Chancellor and tell him, I want to see that scout and whistle right now. I'll meet them in the Chancellor's office. Go." She closed the door and ran down the steps to the 4th floor. Without bothering to get dressed, "You there?" She caught a guard yawning. He snapped to attention. "Get a light on in the Chancellor's office." By the time Nimbus and the scout arrived, she had the map of the Kingdom of Warwick off the shelf and spread out over the desk. "What's going on?" the Chancellor asked. "You're from the south, aren't you, Nimbus?" "I'm from Vernus, Your Eminence." "That's down here at the mouth of the Burnham." "Yes." "Do you know any place south of Kalnara?" "To cross the Burnham River." "No, Your Eminence." She looked back at the map for a moment, and then the two men waited patiently. "So the elves can't get at us from the west unless they have seaworthy ships. And they can't approach us from the north because of the mountains." She looked up this time at the scout. "Yes, Your Evidence. We started an avalanche on the Gloucester Road, and it won't be clear until late spring. The bridges in Kalora were destroyed as well, and they can't come at us from the east or the south because of the Burnham." "What about the Rilland Valley? Can't they get through there?" "No, the snow is too deep in the fields. An elf might be able to walk over it with proper shoes, but he won't be able to bring horses or wagons, and even if they did, they would still have to cross the Ferrandal Dorat. And those passes are closed." She looked again at the map, studying the little lines on it. "If the elephant army was to attack us from our southern gate, how best would they get here?" "They can't," the scout said. "The only bridges across the Burden Gorge were in Kalora, and they've been destroyed. What if they went around Kalnara? What if they crossed the Burnham south of there? The river south of Kalnara is wide and deep. There's number for Door Bridge except those in Kalnara, which aren't there anymore." Medina drummed her fingers on the desk, staring at the map. "What is it, Your Eminence?" Nimbus asked. "I don't know," she said, "but we're missing something. It's not the cold slowing down their advance. Maybe they want us to think it is, but I'm certain they're circling around us. I think they'll attack from the southeast, but that's not possible," the scout said. "These are elves. Do we really know what is possible for them? If they were able to get across, what would that do?" "That would depend on where they crossed. It could wind up dividing us from Brexton's forces in the east, or they could walk in unopposed from the south. Your Evidence, I know every inch of the Burnham. I used to float goods down it, from Galora to Venice with my brother, whose boys we worked it year-round. There is no place to cross. It is as wide and deep as a lake, and as a deadly current even in summer. Without a boat a man can't get across. In winter, it would be suicide." The decision was too important to base on the nightmare of a child. Even though her heart told her she was right, her eyes fell on the little copper pin and the shape of a torch on top and Whistle's chest. "Tell me," she said, "what is that you're wearing on your breast?" He glanced down and smiled, self-consciously. "So Brechton awarded that to me for successfully lighting the fire, signaling the elves' move across the gale wall." "So you actually saw the elven army?" "Yes, Your Evidence." "Tell me then, what color are the uniforms of the owls?" He looked surprised at the question and then replied, "Blue and gold." "Thank you, you can leave. Go back to sleep, get some rest." The scout nodded, bowed, and left the office. What are you thinking, Your Eminence?" the Chancellor asked. "I want word sent to Kalnara to recall Bracton and his troops," she said. "We aren't going to survive Nimbus, even after everything we've done. They're gonna break through our defenses, throw down our walls, and burst into this palace." Nimbus said nothing. He remained straight and calm. "You knew that already, didn't you?" "I have a few illusions, Your Eminence. I won't let my family be slaughtered, not again. There is still hope," he told her. "You have seen to that. All we can do is wait and pray. If you feel that will help." "You don't believe in the guards, Nimbus?" You smiled wryly. "Oh, I most certainly believe in them, Your Eminence. I just don't think they believe in me. Chapter 15. Supremacy. The Harbinger limped to shore without much dignity. Walk managed to create a small sail from what remained, and hoisted it to a pole. He lashed to the stump of the old mast. Then a longer flew across the waves. They barely drifted, but it was enough to make the far shore. Farther down the shore, Royce spotted what looked to be a dock, which they avoided, and instead they anchored in a sheltered cove. Here the beach was only a small spit of land, surrounded by large blocks of broken stone. Each one half the height of a man, they lay tumbled and scattered, like the toys of some giant toddler after a tantrum. The stones glistened from the sea spray, and those closest to the water wore glowing beards of what looked like long, stringy moths. "What bothers me is the lack of gals," Wyatt said, tying off the bow into a rock that rose out of the sand like a colossal finger. "Only a god-forsaken beach is without seagulls." "Really?" Adrian inquired. "The gulls, I would have figured the glowing green water would have you more concerned." "There's that too." Magnus was one of the first off the boat. He hit the sand and ran up the slope to the stone blocks, touching them with his hands, as if to assure himself they were real. Royce was off next. His face had started to take on a green all its own. His elven heritage made him subject to seasickness, and Hadron recalled the days of misery his friend had spent aboard the Emerald Storm. Royce ascended to the top of a large sturdy rock and lay down. Ulrich and Marvin arrived on the beach wide-eyed, looking up at the ruined stone with awe. Arista was the last off, accompanied by Myron, who held her hand. She had slept for more than 2 hours and still had deep shadows beneath her eyes. After reaching the beach, she turned around to view the Harbinger, and a look of remorse crossed her brow. "She's not in much shape for a return trip," Wide stated, looking at the princess. "I was thinking that maybe Ildan and I ought to stay here and work on her while the rest of you fetch that horn. I could rig a few polys in these rocks, and with Eldon's help I might be able to set a new mast. If we manage to find something we can use for one, at the very least, I could run a gib line and reinforce the pole we have. I also think the rider needs some work, and I need to stop the leaks that opened up, or she sink on the way back. I have the pitch for that. I just need to make a fire and get the hull out of the water, which the tide should help with. And if the gazelle spot you," Arrest asked. "Well, I'll do my best to avoid that, but if they come around, I suppose we'll be hiding among the rocks. I'm hoping that after today, we won't be seeing any more of them for a while. Perhaps we have at least a few days before another vessel arrives. Thing is, I'm on this trip for my sailing skills, right? I can't handle a sword as well as a Pickering or Hadrian, and I wasn't brought along for that anyway. Neither was Ildan. Besides, you can leave the excess gear here and travel lighter." Arista nodded. She didn't look strong enough to argue. "I really didn't mean to hit you so hard," Adrian told her as Arista sat down on the sand. "What?" she inquired sluggishly. "Oh no, it's not my head. It's just that I feel exhausted even after sleeping. I feel like I've walked for miles and been up for weeks. You know better than I do." "Do you get that from being whacked in the head?" "No, not really," he replied. "It usually just throbs a while and eggs after that. I feel sort of like you do when you come down, with a cold, weak, tired. My mind just wanders and I can't stay focused. It doesn't help that any time I sleep, I have dreams." "What kind of dreams?" "You think I'm crazy," she said, embarrassed. "I thought that from the first time we met." She smirked at him. "In my dreams, I'm not me. I actually think I'm Ezra Hardin, only it's years ago, before the city was destroyed, before the Emperor was killed, before he was locked up. That's what you get from wearing that robe." She looked down. "It's a really nice robe, very warm. And have you ever seen one that lights up for you? It's a little creepy, maybe." They sat in silence for a minute. Ildan and Wyatt walked around the ship, looking at the hull. They were wasting no time assessing the damage. Ulrich and Marvin ascended up in the rocks. Exploring like children, Myron sat only a few feet away and appeared to be watching them. Adrian stared at the waves as they rolled ashore. Splashing just beyond their feet, they would head off soon, but for now, it was good to sit on solid ground. He would nudge Royce in a bit, but he wanted to give him a few minutes. He expected dangers would be greater from that point on, and preferred Royce to be in top form. "I should thank you," Arista said with downcast eyes and a quiet voice. As if it were a confession, he looked at her curiously. "For what?" "For the crack on the head," she responded, raising a hand to rub the spot. She took the bandage off. Eric was right. I'd lost control. Her hair fell across her face, an auburn curtain, hiding everything but the tip of her nose. It's hard to explain the feeling of it, the power. It's as if I can do anything. Can you imagine knowing you can do anything? It's exciting, alluring, draws you in, and you want it like a hunger. You feel yourself becoming part of something bigger, joining with it, working with it. You sense every drop of water, every blade of grass, and you become them, everything, the air and the stars. You want to see how far you can go, where the edges are only some part of your nose. There are no edges. I never did anything that big before. I spread out too far. I joined with it too much. I was losing myself, I think. It was just so amazing feeling the world respond to me. Like it was a part of me, or I was a part of it. I don't know. I wasn't thinking anymore. I was just feeling, and I don't know what might have happened if you hadn't whacked you. "Yeah, I'm just glad you aren't mad," he said, and meant it. Most people I hit wake up with a slightly different attitude. I suppose they do. She pulled the curtain of hair back and tilted her head up at him. She had a self-conscious smile on her face. "I'd also like to thank you for something else." He looked at her once more, confused and a little worried. "I wanted to thank you for not being afraid of me." Her hair was tangled, her face drawn and weary. She had drooping eyes and thin, pale pink lips. There was a pinch of sand on the tip of her nose. Creases marked her forehead, thin lines of worry. Is there anyone quite like her? Before an urge to brush the sand from her nose. "Who says I'm not afraid of you?" he inquired her. He saw her turning that comment over in her mind, and felt it was best to end the conversation before he said something stupid. He got up, dusted the sand off himself, and went looking for his pack. He had just reached the ship, where Wired was coiling a length of rope. When the two scouts returned, "There's a passage up that way," Morthan announced, grinning. They came to the side of the ship, where they found their packs, and pulling out their water sacks threw their heads back and guzzled to quench their thirst. "It's amazing," Garlic said, wiping the water from his beard. "There are these huge statues of lions. The paws are taller than I am. This really is Persepoquis. I want to go in. We should get going." "Wyatt and Eldon are planning to stay here," Adrian told him. "Why?" he asked, concerned and perhaps a bit annoyed. "They plan to fix the vessel while we're gone, and never ready for us by the time we get back." "Okay, that makes sense. Good sense. That's great. Now let's get our stuff and get going. I've waited all my life to see this." Barrick and Marvin trotted back aboard the Harbinger to find the rest of their gear. King's Adrian sent to White with a shrug. "Be careful," Wyatt told him, "and keep an eye on Gaunt." "Gaunt?" "You are to trusting," Wyatt said, "in order to wear." Gaunt sat near the dwarf and a large stone slab. He spends a lot of time with Magnus, and he was unusually friendly with me and Eldon, like he was buddying up with the drafted members of the party, trying to form a group of dissenters. Remember what I told you on the Emerald Storm? There's always one member of any crew who's looking for a mutiny, and he's our only hope. Adrian responded with a little of irony in his voice. "You'd better be careful too, as you know the Gazelle are no joke. Keep an eye out, don't sleep on the ship, don't light any fires, trust me. I remember the arena of the Palace of the Four Wines. I have no desire to cross swords with him a second time. That's good because this isn't an arena, and there are no rules out here. They are swarm over you like an army of ants. Good luck. Same to you, and make sure this vessel is ready to sail. When we get back, I've been on enough jobs with Royce to know that. While the going in may be slow, the coming out is usually a race. The ruins of the city began at the water's edge, although this was not entirely evident until they left the sand and moved inland where they had a wider perspective. The large stone blocks were part of the broken foundation of white marble columns that had once stood 100 feet tall. They knew this by discovering 3 remaining columns, still upright. How they had managed to remain this way was bewildering as the blocks had shifted precariously. They found the passage all Rick and Marvin had discovered, which began at the feet of 2 huge lions carved from stone. Each was easily 100 feet tall, although one was missing his head, which had fallen away. The remaining lion showed a fierce face, with teeth, beard, and a full, flowing mane. The imperial lions. Miron muttered as they passed under their shadow, and Royce paused to light his lantern. I've seen these before, Arista whispered, her head back, looking up at the sculptures in my dreams. What do you know of this place? Miron, Royce inquired, lifting his light and peering forward into a vast labyrinth of crumbled stone and silhouetted ruins. Which author would you like to hear from? Anton Bullard did a wonderful study of the ancient text, as well as summarize, please. Right, okay. Well, legend has it that this was once a small agrarian village, the home of a farmer's daughter named Persephone. They lived in fear of the elves, who had reportedly burned nearby villages and slaughtered the inhabitants, right down to every man, woman, and child. Persephone's village was next. But a man called Navran appeared in the village. He fell in love with Persephone and vowed to save her. He begged her to leave the village, but she refused. So he decided to stay and swore to protect her. He took charge and rallied the men when the attack came. He defeated the forces of the elves. Saving the village, he revealed himself to be Navran, the son of Meribur, sent to protect his children from the greed of the children of Foral. Many battles later, Navran defeated the elves of the Battle of Adam Parker, and a time of peace with the elves began. Navran wished to build a capital for his great empire and a home for his wife, although he ruled vast tracts of land. Persephone refused to live anywhere other than her village. So it was here that Navran built his capital, naming it Persepleques, the city of Persephone. Over the years, it became the largest and most sophisticated city in the world. It's chronicled as being 5 miles across and the seat of a famous university and library. Scholars came from across the empire to study. The Grand Imperial Palace was built here, and it was a place of temples, gardens, and parks. Records report that the city had clean water, fountains open to the public, and baths where citizens lounged in heated pools. Persepolis was also the home of the imperial bureaucracy, a vast system of officers that administered the empire, controlling its economy and social and political institutions. There were agents responsible for rooting out potential dissidents, suspected criminals, and corrupt officials. And of course, it was home to the Tesh Law Guild and the Senja Council, the Imperial Knights, and the College of Wizards that advised and protected the Emperor through his bureaucracy. The Emperor controlled everything from the forests to mines, farms, granaries, shipyards, and cloth mills. Corruption was held in check by appointing more than one head of each department, and by rotating them out frequently. They never appointed local men who might have ties to those they administered to. Even prostitution was regulated by the empire. Persepleques was a place of great wealth, center of the empire's trade that spanned all of Apeladon and reached even into the exotic Westerlands and north into Estrander. It bustled with richly dressed merchants And the roads were legendary. They were huge, wide thoroughfares of well-laid stone, perfectly straight, that ran for miles in all directions. Trees were planted on either side of them to provide shade, and they were well maintained and marked with milestones. Wells and shelters were placed at regular intervals for the comfort of travelers. There was no famine, no crime, no disease or plague, no droughts were ever recorded, nor floods, nor even harsh frosts. Food was always plentiful, and no one was poor. I can see why. The imperialists want to recapture that ideal, Ulrich observed, which just goes to show how foolish people can be. Gon said no famine, no drought, no disease, no poor. There's about as much chance of that happening as you becoming emperor, Royce asked. God scowled. So what should we be looking for? Royce asked. Myron shook his head. I don't know, he responded, and glanced at Arista, the tomb of Nafran. The princess, tell them. Oh, Myron brightened. That would be under the palace, in the center of the city. Any way to identify it? It's a huge white building with a solid gold dome. Arista answered for him, gaining several surprised looks. She shrugged. I'm guessing. Myra nodded. Good guess. They moved on as before with Royson, the lead fleet to foot, always investigating shadows and crevices. His light bobbing, Ulrich and Marvin followed at a distance, in a manner that reminded Hadrian of a fox hunt. Arista and Myron walked together, both staring up at their surroundings. With great interest, Gaunt and Magnus followed them, occasionally speaking and whispers. Adrian brought up the rear once more, glancing over his shoulder repeatedly. You already missed Wyatt and Eldon. They followed a passage that wove between collapsed rock falls until they reached a street of neatly paved stones, each cut in a hexagon and fitted with stunning precision. Here at last, the mounds of rubble gave way, allowing them to view the shattered remains of the once magnificent city that rose around them, great buildings of rose or white stone, tarnished by age and curtained in debris, had lost none of their beauty. What immediately captured Hadrian's attention was how tall they were. Pillars and arches soared hundreds of feet in the air, supporting marvelously decorated entablatures and pediments. Great domes of burnished bronze and stone, crown buildings with diameters and access of 100 feet, were far larger than anything you'd ever seen before. Colonnades supporting a row of arches ran for hundreds of yards as mere decoration. Standing out before load-bearing walls, statues of unknown men were exquisitely sculpted, such that they might move at any minute. They adorned silent fountains, pedestals, and building facades. The grandeur of the city was stunning, as was its rattled state. Each building, each pillar, each stone appeared to have dropped from some great height. Blocks of stone lay askew and shifted out of place. Some teetered beyond imagination, loose, twisted and misaligned, so that it looked as if the weight of a sparrow would topple a structure of 1,000 tons. The devastation was not even or predictable. Some buildings missed whole walls, most no longer had roofs, while others revealed the shift of only a few stones, despite the disarray. Other aspects of the city were astonishingly preserved. A seller's market stood untouched. Brooms remained standing, stacked on display. A pot stall exhibited several perfect clay urns, the brilliant ceramic glazes of red and yellow, dimmed only by a coat to fine dust, on the left side of the street. In front of a disheveled four-story residence lay 3 skeletons, the clothes still on them, but rotted nearly to dust. What happened to this place? Gaunt asked. No one knows exactly, Myron replied. Although there have been many theories, Theodore Brindle asserted that it was the wrath of Maribor for the murder of his blood. Dyko Amos the Stout found evidence that it was destroyed by the Senjar. In particular, the wizard Ezra Hardin, Professor Edmund Hall, whose trail we are on, believed it was a natural catastrophe. After crossing the salty sea and seeing the state of the city, he concluded in his journal that the ancient city sat upon a cavern of salt, which was dissolved with a sudden influx of water, thus causing the city above to collapse. There are several other more dubious explanations, such as demons, and even one rumor concerning the bitterness of dwarves and how they pulled it down out of spite. Magnus scoffed, "Humans always blame dwarves. A baby goes missing and it was a dwarf that stole it. A princess runs off with a second son of a king, and it was a dwarf who lured her to a deep prison, and when they find her with the prince, oh, she was rescued. A king is stabbed in the back in his own chapel, and the princess's tower is turned into a death trap." Royce called back to them, "Friends are betrayed and trapped in a prison." "Yes, I can see your surprise. Where do they get such ideas?" "Gum is elven ears," Magnus said. "But don't ask shocked, Royce is an elf." "No, he's not well," Rick said. He looked back over his shoulder. "Is he?" "Why don't you ask him, Arista?" responded Royce. The bobbing light halted. "I don't see how. This is the time or place for discussing my lineage. God brought it up, I was just asking." "You don't look elven. That's because I'm a mirror. I'm only part elven, and since I never met my parents, I can't tell you any more than that." "You're part elven," Myron said. "How wonderful for you. I don't think I've ever met an elf, although I have met you. So perhaps I have met others and don't know it. Still, it is quite exciting, isn't it? Is this going to be an issue?" Royce inquired the king. "Are you planning on questioning my allegiance?" No, I wasn't," Arg said. "You've always been a loyal servant." Adrian started walking forward, wondering if he had returned Royce's dagger too soon. "Servant loyal?" Royce inquired, his voice growing lower and softer. Never a good sign, Adrian thought. "Royce, we need to keep moving, right?" "Absolutely," he said, staring directly at Ulrich. "What did I say?" the king inquired after Royce resumed his advance. "I was merely stop," Agent told him. "Forgive me, Your Majesty. But just stop, he can still hear you, and you'll only make matters worse." Eric appeared as if he would speak again, but then scowled and moved on. Arista offered her brother a sympathetic look. As she passed him, they continued in silence. Following the light, on occasion Royce whispered for them to wait, and they sat in silence, tense and worried. Adrian kept his hands on the pommels of his swords, watching and listening. Then Royce would return, and off they would go once more. They moved to a much wider boulevard. The buildings became more elaborate. Taller, often with facades of chiseled columns, pillars lined the avenue. Tall monoliths covered in detailed engravings. Epigraphs and images of men, women, and animal figures. One very large building was totally shattered, forcing them to climb over a mountain of rubble. The going was treacherous, with slabs of broken rock, the size of houses, that were loose enough to shift with their weight. Driven to inch-long ledges and crawl through dark holes. They all welcomed a rest on the far side. They sat, and what had once been a great flight of marbled steps, which now went nowhere, and looked down the city's main road. Each building was tall and made from finely carved stone, usually a white marble or rose-colored granite. Fountains appeared intermittently along the wide thoroughfare, and as he stared, Adrian could imagine a time when children ran in the streets, splashing in the pools, and swinging from the spear arm a statue held out. You could almost see the colorful awnings, the markets, the crowds. Music and the smells of exotic food would fill the air. Much like in Dagestan, only here the streets were clean, the air cool. What a wonderful place it must have been. What a wonderful time to have lived. "A library," Myron whispered as they sat, his eyes fixed on a tall circular building, with a small dome and a colonnade surrounding it. "How do you know?" Arista asked. "It says so," he replied. "On top, their imperial repository of tones and knowledge." Roughly translated, "At least I don't suppose I could." He trailed off, his eyes hopeful. "If you go in there, we might never get you out." Adrian said, "We need to camp, and we still don't know anything about the horn." Arista said, "If Myron could find something." "I'll take a look," Roy said. "Agent, come with me, everyone else wait here." Just as if you were on a job, Royce circled the library twice, making a careful study of the entrances and exits, before moving to the two great bronze doors, each decorated in ornate sculptured relief, depicting a bisected scene of a man, handing a scroll and a laurel to a younger man, amidst the aftermath of a great battle. Had you noticed a river and a familiar-looking tower? At the edge of a waterfall, in the upper right, the doors were marred, badly dented and bent, bearing marks from a large blunt hammer. Adrian slowly, quietly drew one sword. Roy sat down and hooded the lantern, then pulled the doors open and slipped inside. One of the many rules Hadron had learned from the start was never to follow Royce into a room. That was how it all gone so bad and over none. Royce had slipped into the ground tower as delicately as a moth through window. Yet, unlike on the previous night, the room was not empty. A priest sat in the small outer chamber. It didn't matter, as he had not seen or heard Royce. But then Hadrian blundered in. The man screamed. They ran. Royce one way, Hadrian the other. It is a coin flip that Hadrian won. The guards came around the tower on Royce's side, while they were busy chasing and wresting Royce down. Hadget made it back to the rope. He was safe. All he had to do was climb back down, retrieve his horse from the thickets, and ride away. That was exactly what Royce expected him to do, what Royce would have done in his place. But back then Royce did not know him. Adrian heard the 3 taps from inside the library, and grabbing the lantern crept inside. It was black, and he was met with a terrible confluence of smells. The dominant odor was a thick burntwood sand, but a more pungent, rotted meat stink managed to cut through. From the darkness he heard Roy say, "We're clear." Lighted up, Adrian lifted the lantern's hood to reveal a scorched hall, burned black and filled with piles of ash. The room was still beautiful, beyond anything else Adrian had ever seen, for stories tall. The walls circling him were marvelously crafted. Tiers of marble arcades, towering pillars rings the coffin dome, and supported the great arches, joining the arcades to each other. Around the rim, a colonnade of white marble was interspersed with lifelike bronze statues of 12 men, each of which had to be at least 20 feet tall. From the floor they appeared life-sized. Great chandeliers of gold hung around the perimeter. The black cracked remains of tables formed a circular pattern of desks, with a great office in the center. A fresco painting of wonderful scenes of various landscapes formed the lower part of the dome, while the greater portion, made of glass, now lay in shards, scattered across the beautiful mosaic floor in the center of the room. Near the office bench was its only inhabitant, surrounded by a few singed books, papers, quills, 3 lanterns, and an oil can lay what remained of an old man. He was on his back, his head resting on an absack, his legs wrapped in a blanket like Bernie. This man was dead, and as he had Bernie. Adrian recognized him. "Anton Bullard," he said, and knelt beside the body of the elderly man he'd befriended in Calais. It was not as ravaged by death as Bernie. No sea crabs here. Bullard, who had always been pale in life, was now a bluish gray, his complexion waxy. His white hair was brittle, and spectacles still rested on the end of his nose. Bernie was right, Adrian told Blood. You didn't survive the trip, but then again neither did he. Hadron used the old man's blanket to wrap him up, and together they carried his body out and set it off to the side, under a pile of rocks. The smell lingered, but it wasn't nearly as pungent. When the others arrived, they stared with disappointment. Myron, most of all exhaustion, went out and they threw their packs down, while Royce relocked the door. Myron looked up, his eyes scanning the tears. And countless aisles where books must have once lay, but now they housed only piles of ash. And Hadrian noticed the monk's hands tremble. "We rest here for a few hours," Boy said. "Here?" God inquired. "The smell is awful. Charcoal and something else." "What is that disgusting?" God asked. "We found a body," Page and told them. Another member of the last team, the patriarch sent in from the same group as Bernie. From the Harbinger and a friend, we took his remains out. Was he burned? Myron inquired fearfully. No. Adrian placed a hand on his shoulder. I don't think anyone was here when it caught fire, but it was burned recently, the monk said. It wouldn't still smell like this after 1,000 years. Perhaps our resident sorcerers can do something about the stench, don't ask. This brought stone looks from Hadrian, Ulrich and Marvin. What? Deegan asked. Are we to continue to tiptoe around it? She is a magician, a mage, a wizard, a sorcerer. A witch, pick whatever term you prefer. Beat me senseless if you like, but after our little boat ride, there's no debating the reality of that fact. Ulrich strode toward Gaunt with a threatening look and a hand on his sword. No. Arista stopped him. He's right, there's no sense in hiding it or pretending. I suppose I am a. Did you say wizard S? That was not too bad. As she said this, her robe glowed once more, and a mystical white light filled the chamber with a wonderful brilliance, as if the moon had risen in their midst. That's splendid. Best that it's out in the open. Best that we could all say it. Royce is an elf, Adrian attached law. Marvin accounts and detection swordsman, or Ricky King Myron. A monk with an indelible mind. Magnus a dwarven trapsmith. Deegan the heir of Navran, and I am a wizard ass. But if you call me a witch again, I promise, you'll finish this journey as a frog in my pocket. Are we clear? Gaunt nodded. Good. Now I'm exhausted, so you'll have to live with the smell. With that, Arista threw herself down, wrapped up in her blankets, and closed her eyes. As she did, the robe dimmed and faded until at last it was dark. The rest of them followed her lead. Some swallowed a handful of food or a mouthful of water before collapsing. But no one spoke. Agent tore open another packaged meal. Surprised at how few we had left, they'd better find the horn soon, or they might all end up like Bullard. What happened to him? It was the question he drifted to sleep on. Agent felt a nudge and opened his eyes to Marvin's face and wild hair hanging over him. Royce told me to wake you. It's your watch. Hogan sat up groggily. How long and who do I wake? You're last, but I just fell asleep. You've been snoring for hours. Give me the chance to get a little sleep. Adrian wiped his eyes, wondering how he could best estimate the length of an hour, and shivered. He always felt chilled when he woke up. Before his blood got running properly, the cool subterranean air did nothing to help. He wrapped his blanket around his shoulders and stood up. The party, all laid together like blanket-shrouded corpses. Bundles of dark lumps on the floor, each had swept the broken glass back and had clustered in a ring, marking the border of their camp. The lantern was still burning, and off to one side, near where he had found Ballard's body, huddled in a ball and wrapped in his hooded frock and blanket, sat Myron. Tell me you didn't stay up reading, he whispered, sitting down next to him. Among the piles of papers and books, which Myron had neatly stacked, oh no, he replied. I was beside more than when Ulrich woken for his watch. I just couldn't get back to sleep, not in here. These papers, he said, picking up a handful. They were written by Anton Bullard, famous historian. I found them scattered. He was here. I think he's the one who died. He used to say he couldn't remember anything unless he wrote it down. Anton Bullard. Myron looked astonished. You've met him. I traveled briefly with him in Calais. A nice old man, and a lot like you in many ways. He wrote the history of Apollodon, an incredible work. It was the book I was describing the night you found me. At the Wines Abbey, Myron lifted the parchments, holding them up to Hadrian. His legs were broken. They left him here with some food and water, and the lantern for light. His notes are sloppy lines running over one another. I think he wrote them in the dark, to save oil for reading, but I can read most of it. He was with 3 others, a Dr. Levy, Bernie, who we later arrest, and Sentinel Franek, who I gather was their leader. Anton wasn't very pleased with him. There was also a man named Stahl, but he died before they set sail. Yes, we knew them too. What happened? Apparently they acquired the Harbinger from a warlord of some sort called Air and Dabin. He also arranged for a gazelle guide to take them into the city. All went well, if not a bit tense, until they arrived at this library here. They found evidence that this had been the last stand for a previous team, and he mentioned the names Sir Grave and Dent Retinol. Math and Bulls, so it was them. They apparently barricaded themselves inside. But the doors were forced open. Wellart's group found their gear. Blood stains and lots of gazelle arrows, but no bodies. No, they wouldn't. Endon suggested they leave him to sit and read, while they went on to explore for the horn. So the library, it was fine. Perfect, to use the words of Anton Ballard. Filled with thousands and thousands of books, Bullard wrote. There's perhaps 100 tones on birds, just birds, and above those, another 100 on the imperial seafaring, mercantile industries. I followed an aisle back to a swirling brass stair that corkscrewed up to yet another floor, like an attic, and it was filled to the ceiling with records of the city births, deaths, land titles, and transfers. Amazing. What happened? Tranok burned it. Myron said they had to hold Handlin down. After that he refused to go any farther. Tranok broke both his legs to prevent him from escaping the city and left him here, just in case they had a question he needed to answer. Anton salvaged these from the ash. He pointed to the small stack of 5 books. He lived for nearly 3 months, in the end with the oil gone. He was trying to feel the words on the page with his fingertips. Nothing about what happened to the others, no, but he appeared to realize something of tremendous, important. He began writing about it in earnest. But it must have been after the oil run out, and I suspect starvation was taking its toll. His krill work was abysmal. He wrote something about a betrayal, a murder, and something he referred to as the Great Lie. But the only thing he wrote clearly was the phrase, Morin Dule of the Mirror Leaf, which was underlined twice. The rest is indecipherable, although it goes on for 10 more pages, and there are many exclamation points. Only the last line is fully readable. It says, such a fool was I, such fools are we all. Any idea what this Mardru, Lay of the Mirror Leaf, is more into? Lay and Mirror Leaf be corrected. The Mirror Leaf is. Bar was one of the 7 tribes of elves. 7 tribes. Yes, actually. Bullard wrote of them in his first book years ago. There were 7 tribes of elves named from the ancestors that founded them. The Ascendoir known as the Hunters, the Gridri the Farmers, the Eileen the Builders, the Merileth the Mages, the Instardia the Warriors, the Nilin the Crafters, and the Umalin the Priests of Pharaoh. Everyone knows that Pharaoh created the Earls first, and for thousands of years only they and the creations of Muriel existed. On the face of Elan, Bullard unveiled that there was friction. From the beginning, elves once fought elves clan against clan. A feud existed between the Insteria and the Merileth, to where Arista quivered in her sleep and let out a muffled cry. She's been like that all night. Myron told him. Adrian nodded. She told me she's been suffering from nightmares. But I think they're more than dreams. Adrian watched her. As he did, he felt Myron's hand on his. Looking up, he saw the monk offer him a sad smile. Adrian drew his hand away. I think I'd better start waking people. Myron nodded, as if he understood more than Hadron had meant to say. Chapter 16. The White River. Mintz was convinced that the vast majority of his 10 long years, soon to be 11, had been spent with frozen feet. Even the Empress's gifts of thick wool cloaks, hats, mittens, boots, and scarves were incapable of withstanding the biting winds. His fingers kept going numb, and he had to make fists to keep the blood flowing. This must be the coldest winter the world has ever seen if the water in my eyes freezes. Will I be unable to blink? Men stood with a bucket in hand and stomped on the river with his frozen feet solid as stone. He heard no cracking, nor the gurgle of liquid lapping beneath the surface. There would be no water again, which meant another miserable day. Warming cups of snow under their tunics, Adrian had ordered them not to build a fire, and Renwick was adamant about obeying. The task was unpleasant, but they could make do. Mince wasn't sure how much longer the horses could go without. Lack of water was not the horses' only problem. Even though the boys had tethered them in a tight pack and built a windbreak from pine boughs and thickets, the animals were still suffering from the cold. Ice formed on their backs, icicles hung from their noses, and that morning Mince had seen two of them lying down. One was producing a small puff of white mist. At frighteningly long intervals, the other didn't appear to breathe at all. The ones lying down with the horses, on the outside of the pack. The ones exposed to the most wind, the big freeze as Kind had named it, had occurred 3 days earlier and come upon them overnight. The previous day they'd run around in warm sunshine, playing tag without scarves or hats. Then the sky had turned gray and a frigid air blew in. That morning Elbright had returned from fetching the water, reporting that only a narrow stream ran down the center of the river the day after the river was gone, completely replaced by a smooth expanse of white. That afternoon, when the snow started to fall, the flakes were no larger than grains of sand. The 5 boys had been living in a snow cave beneath the eaves of a holly tree, and when the freeze came they dug their shelter deeper and built a windbreak by covering the opening with lashed pine boughs. Time passed slowly after the big freeze, with the temperature so bitter. They no longer went out except to relieve themselves. The only fun they had had was when Brown unveiled the trick. He got up miserable, shivering and cursing, and in a fit of frustration, he spit. It was so cold that the liquid cracked in the air. They spent the next few hours trying to see who could get the loudest snap. Kind was the best, but had always been the best spitter. As fun as cracking spit was, it pushed away the bored amongly temporarily. And they tired of the game as the cold wind blew, and the temperature continued to drop. Menz could not help wondering how long they would have to stay. He should have headed back to the hovel, what they began calling their snow cave, but instead scanned the length of the broad, white trail that ran north and south, like a shining crystal road. Mince was trying to see if some portion was clear. Perhaps there was a place where the current prevented the ice from forming. He looked for a change in color, but there was nothing but a never-ending expanse of white. Still, something caught his eye. Far to the north he saw movement. A long gray line crossed the river. There were people tall and slender, wearing identical cloaks. He stared amazed at the sight and wondered if perhaps there were ghosts, for in the stillness of the winter's morning, he heard no sound of their passing. Men stood staring, but it wasn't until he saw a glint of armor that it occurred to him what he was actually seeing. The revelation froze him as instantly as if he was spit, turning solid in the morning air. Elves, as he watched the spectral cavalcade. They marched 3 abreast in the muted light, passing like phantoms on the ridge. They rode on steeds that, even at a distance, Mince could tell surpassed any breed. Raised by men with broad chests, tall ears, proud arched necks, and hooves that pranced rather than walked. These animals were ethereal. The bridles and equestrian gowns were adorned in gold and silk, as if the animals were statelier than the noblest human king. Upon them, each rider wore a golden helm and carried a spear, with a streaming silver banner licking the air. The sound of music reached his ears, a wild, capricious, but beautiful euphony that haunted his spirit and caused him to unwillingly take a step forward. Joining the sound was the wonderful lilt of voices. They were light and airy, and reminded Mince of flutes and harps speaking to one another. They sang in a language Mince could not understand, but he didn't need to. The melody and plaintive beauty of the sound carried him with it. He felt warm and content and took another step forward. Before long the music faded, as did the sight of them, as they finished crossing the river and disappeared into the foothills. Mince, you heard Albright and felt hands shaking him. "He's over here," the little idiot fell asleep on the ice. "Wake up, you fool. What's he doing way up here?" "I found the bucket a half a mile back." Kind's voice was more distant and out of breath. "It's almost dark. We need to get him back. I'll carry him. You run ahead and tell Renwick to get a fire started." "You know, what do you say? I don't care. We don't get him warm. He'll die." Lower the sounds of feet on snow. Sounds of urgency and fear, but Mince didn't care. He was warm and safe, and still remembered the music lingering in his head, calling to him when Kind returned to camp. Only Brand was there, Brand the Bold, as he liked to call himself. It was a bold boast for a kid of 13, but no one questioned it. Brand had survived a knife fight, and that was more than any of them could claim. "We need to get a fire started," Kind said, returning to the hovel. "We found Mince and he's near dead with cold." "I'll get kindling," Rand replied, and ran out into the snow. Kind got the tinder box from the supplies they had not touched and cleared a space near the front of the shelter. Brand was back in minutes with a sheet of birch bark, a handful of brown grass, tiny dry twigs, and even a bit of rabbit fur. He dropped the treasures off and set back out. As he did, Kind spotted Albright carrying Mince on his back. The boy's head rolled with each step. It reminded him of how deer looked when hunters brought them in. The right said, "Make a bed, put down lots of needle branches. Pile them up, we want to keep them off the snow." Kind nodded and ran out of the shelter. Past the horses, 2 more were lying down. He entered a grove of spruce trees, where he tore the branches from the trunks. Getting his mittens sticky from the sap, he made for trips, and when he finished, Mince had a thick bed to lie on. Albright had a small, delicate flame alive on the birch sheet. His mittens were on the snow beside him. His bare fingers were red, and he frequently breathed on them, or slapped his thigh as he squatted in the snow. "Fingers go numb in seconds." What are you doing?" Renwick said, coming up the slope from the south, when Menz had not returned after going for water. They all went searching in different directions. Renwick took the southern river bank and returned only now that the sky was darkening and the temperature plummeted, although he was also an orphan. Renwick wasn't one of their gang. He lived at the palace, where his father used to be a servant, while really no more than a page. The boy had served as squire to Sir Hadrian. During wintertide, all the boys were impressed by Hadrian's spectacular success during the games, and his admiration spilled over to Renwick. The boy was also older, perhaps a year or two Albright senior. Unlike those of the rest, Renwick's clothes fit him properly, and even matched in color. "We have to get a fire going," Albie told him, even as he fed the tongues of flame little sticks. "We found Mince on the ice. He's freezing to death. We can't build a fire, Adrian. Do you want him to die?" Renwick looked at the growing fire and the tendrils of white smoke sneaking from it. Then that Mince lying on the spruce bed. Kind could see the debate going on inside him. "He's my best friend," Kind told him. "Please," Renwick nodded. "It's getting dark, the smoke won't be visible. But we need to contain the light as much as we can. Let's bank the snow walls higher. Damn, it is cold." Brand returned with more wood, larger branches, and even a few broken logs. His cheeks and nose were red, and ice crystals formed around his nose and mouth. "You need to keep him awake," Albright told him, as he tended the fire as if it were a living thing. "If he stays asleep, he'll die." Kind shook Mince and even slapped him across the face, but the boy didn't seem to notice. Meanwhile, Renwick and Brand boosted the windbreak wall, which not only contained the light, but also reflected the heat. Albright coaxed the fire, cooing to it, like it was a child it brought into the world. "Come on, baby, eat that branch, eat it. That's right, there you go. Tastes good, doesn't it? Eat all of it to make you strong." Albright's baby became a full-grown fire, and soon the frigid cold fell back. It was the first time in days any of them had known real warmth. Kine's feet and fingers began to ache, and his cheeks on the tip of his nose burned as he thought out. Beyond the mouth of their snow cave, darkness fell, made deeper by the bright light of the fire. Wenwick seized a pot from the supplies, filled it with snow and set it near the fire to melt. Albright refused to let him put it on his fire. They sat in silence, listening to the friendly sound of the flames. Soon the shelter was warm enough, but Albright took off his hat and even his cloak. The rest of them followed his lead, with Kinney laying his over mince. "Can we eat now?" Brand asked. Renwick had established a firm rule that they ration their food, and they all ate together to make certain no one had more than his share. Like the cups of water, they kept their meals inside their shirts, up against their skin, since it was the only way to keep the food from freezing. "Solid, I suppose," Renwick said passively, but looked just as hungry as any of them. Brand pulled out his stick of salt pork and set it near the fire. "I'm having a hot meal tonight." The rest of them mimicked them, and before long the smell of hot meat filled the cave. They all waited to see how long Brand could hold out. It wasn't long, and soon everyone was ripping into the pork and making exaggerated smacks of ecstasy in the midst of the rivalry. Mince sat up. "Supper, you're alive," Kind exclaimed. "You're not eating my share." "Are you?" We should about yelled at him. "You little idiot. Why did you decide to take a nap on the ice?" "I fell asleep," Mince asked. "Surprised you don't remember." Kinney inquired. "We found you curled up on the river snoring." "You should thank Narrated for your life," Albright added. "And what were you doing so far north?" "I was watching the elves." "Elves?" Renwick asked. "What elves?" "I saw the elven army crossing the river, a whole line of them." "There were no elves," Albert declared. "You dreamed it." "No, I saw them on horseback, and they play this beautiful music. I started listening and what? I don't know." "Well, you fell asleep is what about?" "Told him, and if I had heard you snoring, you'd be dead by now." "He would, wouldn't he?" Renwick muttered, looking out of the dark. "The elves, you said they were all on horseback." "None on foot." "How about wagons?" No wagons, just elves on horses, beautiful horses." "What is it? How about?" asked. He didn't see the elven army. "I know that," Albright responded with a chuckle. "It was a dream." No, it wasn't," Renwick corrected. "He saw elves, but it wasn't the army, it was only the vanguard, the advanced patrol. I heard the knights talking. The elven army travels at night, but hardly anyone has ever seen them, and no one knows why. But I think I do now." They all looked at Mince. "He'd be dead," Albright said, nodding. "But that means the army is." "It's night." They all looked at the fire, which it melted down a half-foot into the snow, so that it burned in its own little well. Albright was the one who kicked it out. It made a dying hiss as the snow swallowed the flames. They all worked to bury the embers until it was a small mound of dirty brown, with sticks and grass sticking out. No one said a word as they felt around in the faint light for their cloaks and mittens. Silence hung in the air, since it was winter. They didn't expect the sounds of birds or frogs, but now not even the wind breathed. The constant rustle of naked branches was absent, as were the random cracks and snaps. They poked their heads out of the cave, lifting them attentively. Above the blind and around the bundle of pine bars, they couldn't see anything. "They're out there," when we whispered. "They're crossing the frozen river and sneaking up on Equester from the south. We have to warn them." "You want us to go out there?" Berbeardy inquired skeptically. "Where they are, we have to try. I thought we had to stay here and watch the horses." "We do, but we also have to warn the city." "I'll go. The rest of you stay here. Albright, you'll be in charge. You can explain to Adrian why I left." As he spoke, he moved to the gear and began picking supplies. "Keep the fire out, stay inside, and..." He paused a moment, then said, "Cover your ears if you hear any music." No one said a word as he slipped out. They all watched as he inched nervously to the horses. He picked the one closest to the middle of the bunch and saddled it. When he was gone, all that remained was the deep silence of a cold winter's night. Chapter 17, The Grand Mar. The party had stopped again since they'd left the library. Their progress through the ancient city had been tedious as Royce was pausing frequently. Sometimes, he forced them to wait for what felt like hours. As he scattered ahead, the rest of them sitting among the rubble. This time he had left them in the middle of what appeared to be an alley. With tall buildings towering on either side, the Arista sighed and leaned against one more. Someone ahead of her had stepped on a piece of fabric, the boot print revealing the faded colors of blue and green. She bent down and picked a small flag from under a thick coating of dust and dirt. This one was a handheld version the sword people waved at celebrations. Looking up, she spotted a window, and hanging from that was an old and faded banner that read Prestivius found Arianus. What does that say? She inquired Myron, but she was certain she already knew. Happy Founders Day, the monk replied. Next to where she found the flag, she noticed a small object. Reaching out, she found a copper pin and the shape of the letter P. Now more than ever she wished she could remember the dream from the night before. But the more she tried to recall, the more it slipped away. Royce returned, waving them forward, and then he led them in a circle back to the boulevard. Here they began to see skeletons. They were in groups of 2s and 3s, lying crumpled to the ground, as if they had died right where they stood. The only way to tell how many there were was by the number of skulls in the piles. As they progressed, the bone count increased. Skeletons lined either side of the road, with skull counts of 10 deep. They entered a small square, a portion of which was flooded, where the ground was cracked and sank away at a dramatic angle. The same green light that illuminated the sea lit the square and revealed a raised platform on which was a great statue of a man. He stood 20 feet tall with a strong, youthful physique. A sword was in his right hand and a staff in the other. Arista had seen similar statues several times throughout the city, and in each case the head was missing. Broken at the neck and shattered, Roy stopped again. Any idea for getting close to the palace? He inquired, looking at Myron. I only know that it's near the center, the monk replied. The palace is at the end of the Grand Mar, Arista told them. That's what they used to call the boulevard. Or on now, so it's just up ahead, the Grand Mar. Myron said more to himself than to her, and then nodded the marchway. What are you babbling about? Auric asked. There was said to be a great avenue in Persepliques, called the Grand Imperial Marchway, so called as it was often the site of parades. Ancient descriptions declared it to have been wide, enough for 12 soldiers to walk abreast, and that it was made up of 2 lanes, divided by a row of trees. Imperial troops would march down the right side to the palace, with the emperor would review them from his balcony, and then they would return down the other side. They were fruit trees, Arista said. The trees that grew in the center of the Grandma, fruit trees that blossomed in spring. They used to make a fermented drink from the blossoms, called trembles. How do you know that? Myron asked. She looked at him and pretended to be surprised. I'm a wizard ass. They paused to have a short meal. On the steps of an impressive building, off the main boulevard, stone lions, similar to those that guarded the entrance to the city, set on either side. A fountain stood in the street. At the center of an intersection, the water no longer sprayed, and the pool was filled with a black liquid. What books have you got there? All the cast seeing. Myron sifted through his pack and pulled out one of the 5 that Bullard had saved. This one is called The Forgotten Race by Dubrian Ash. It deals mostly with the history of the dwarves. What's that now? Magnus asked, leaning over to look closer at the pages. According to this, mankind is actually native to Calais. Isn't that interesting? And war started in what we know as Delgos. Elves, of course, are from Erevan, but they quickly occupied Avron. "What about the gazelle?" Adrian asked. "Funny you should ask," he said, flipping back several pages. "I was just reading about that too. You see, men appeared in Calais during the Yurten Doran and would have more than asked. It means the great struggle with the children of Drone. You see, the dwarves warred with the elves for centuries, nearly 600 years in fact, until the fall of Drummondr in 1705. That's pre-imperial reckoning, of course. About 2,000 years before Navran built this city. The dwarves went subterranean after that. As it turns out, the early human tribes would have failed, perished if not for the contact they had with the exiled dwarves who traded with them." "Aha," the dwarf said. "And how do they treat us for our kindness now?" "Ghettos. Refusals of citizenship, bans on dwarf and gills. Special taxes, persecution. It's a sad reward." Quiet Royce suddenly told everyone and stood up. He looked left and then right. "Get ready to move," he said, and leaving the lantern, he ascended down the steps, heading back the way they had come. "You heard him," Adrian said, "but we just sat down or a complaint. If Roy says get ready to move, and he has that look on his face, you do what he says if you want to live." They gathered their belongings back into their bags. Arista took one more mouthful of salt, pork, and a swallow of water. Before stashing the rest in her pack, she was just pulling the straps over her shoulders. When Royce reappeared, "We're being tracked," he told them in a whisper. "How many?" Adrian asked. "5. A hunting party." Adrian drew his swords. "Everyone get moving. Royce and I will catch up." "But they're just 5, Arista protested. "Can't we avoid them? It's not the 5 I'm worried about." Adrian told her, "Now go. Just keep moving up the avenue." He and Royce moved back down the road at a trot. She watched them go as a sinking feeling pulled at her stomach. Auric led them forward at a run, past the fountain and on up the grandma. This part of the city was familiar to her. This road, these buildings. She had seen them before, gone with a brilliant white, alabaster walls and brightly painted doors. Now they were dingy and brown, cracked, fractured, chipped, and like everything else, covered in a layer of dirt, as in the rest of the city. The columned halls stood on misaligned stones. Eric led them around a massive fallen statue, whose head had severed at its neck and lay on its side, its features bashed and broken. They then leapt a fallen column, and as soon as she cleared it, Arista stopped. She knew this pillar. It was the column of the stone. She turns left and saw the narrow road Ebonydale. That was the way Ezrahaddon had gone to meet Garish and Navrik. She looked forward down the Maw. She should be able to see the dome, but it was not there. Ahead was only rubble. Arista, she heard all recording to her, and she ran once more. Royce and Hedron paused near the headless statue. With the algae in the water, cast an eerie green radiance to the underside of all things, Royce motioned with 2 spread fingers that a pair were coming up one side of the street and 2 on the other. While the 2 pairs were mere shadows, to Hadrian the 5th was quite visible, as he loped up the center of the boulevard like an ape, hunched over and traveling on 3 limbs. His massive claws clicked intentionally on the stone. As signals to the others, every few feet he would pause, raise his head and sniff the air. With his hooked ring-pierced nose, he wore a headdress, made from the black and thin of a tiger shark, a mark of his station, a token he would have obtained alone in the sea, with no more than his claws. He was the chief warrior of the hunting party, the largest and meanest, and the others looked to him for direction. They all carried the traditional satchel blades, curved scimitars, narrow at the hilt and wider at the tip, or a half-moon scoop formed a double-edged point. Like all gazelle, he also carried a small trillion bow, with a quiver slung over one shoulder. Royce drew out Alvastoni and nodded to Hadrian as he slipped into the darkness. Agent gave him a minute, then taking a breath, he also moved forward. He closed the distance, keeping the statue between him and the gazelle. To his surprise, he was able to reach the platform before the warrior noticed him and let out the expected howl. Immediately arrows whistled and glinted off the stone. The warrior rushed him, his satchel slicing the air. Fighting a gazelle was always different from fighting men. But the moment the two swords connected, Hadron no longer needed to think. His body moved on its own, a step, a lunge. The Finnod warrior responded exactly as Adrian wanted. Adrian caught the warrior's next stroke with his short sword and saw the momentary shock in the gazelle's eyes when his bastard sword came around, removing his arm at the elbow. A short spin and Hadrian took the warrior's head, fin and all. A high-pitched shriek announced the charge of two more gazelle. Hadrian always appreciated how they announced their attacks. He was able to step out from his shelter. Now the rain of arrows having ended, the beard, the pointed teeth and black gums cackling, Hadrian shoved the length of his short sword into the stomach of the closest. Dark blood bubbled up from the wound. Without looking to see the reaction of the remaining gazelle, he swung his other blade behind him and felt it sink into flesh. Agent heard fast-moving footsteps and looked up across the open square. Royce ran at him, carrying a gazelle bow and quiver of arrows. The thief was making no attempt at stealth, his cloak flying behind him. "What's up? Did you get the others?" "Yep," he said as he ran by. He tossed the bow and quiver to Hadrian and added, "You might need these." Adrian chased after him as he ran back up the grandma. "What's the hurry?" They weren't alone. Adrian glanced back over his shoulder but saw nothing. "How many? A lot." "How many are a lot?" "Too many to stand around and count." The party reached the end of the boulevard, which looked nothing like what Arista remembered from her dream. The Illyrium fountain with its 4 horses, bursting out of the frothing waters, was gone, crushed by giant stones. To the right, the rotunda of the Sangarium still stood, but it was a faded, broken version of its former self. The dome gone, the walls blackened. To the left, the columned facade of the Hall of Tesla remained intact, while it had weathered the years better. The building was just as grime-covered as the rest. Most importantly, the great golden dome of the magnificent palace. In fact, the whole palace was missing. Before her, only a hopeless mountain of rubber remained, all around the perimeter. Every inch of space was carpeted with bones of the dead. Reaching the end of the road, Oryx spun around and held the lantern high. "Arista, which way?" She shook her head and shrugged. "The palace, it should be just ahead of us." I think it's destroyed. That's just great God, Ballard. "Now what do we do?" "Shut up," Marvin barked at him. "Is this as far as Horgot?" Oric inquired. Myron, no. The monk responded. He wrote that he entered the palace. How he found a crevice where? He wrote, fearful of the drums in the darkness and afraid to sleep in the open. I sought refuge in a pile of rocks. I found a crevice, just large enough for me to slip through, expecting nothing more than a mere pocket to sleep in. I was elated to discover a buried corridor on my way out. I was careful to mark it so that I might find it. Should I return this way again? They began searching, crawling among the boulders and broken stones. The collapse of the building covered the entire breadth of the broad boulevard, with a mass of fallen stones containing hundreds of crevices, each of which might hide an entrance. They'd only begun looking when Royce and Adrian returned, the weapons still drawn and slick with dark blood. That's not good. She heard Hadrian say the moment he saw the pile, "There's a crevice somewhere that leads inside." Arista said, "There's a horde of gazelle right behind us." Royce told her, "Everyone inside that building on the left." Adrian shouted. They ran across the square, struggling over the piles of bones and rocks that blanketed the walk and steps up to the Hall of Tesla. Yelps and cries erupted behind them. Looking back, Arista spotted goblins skidding across the stone, scratching their claws like dogs on a hunt. Their eyes flashed in the darkness, the light from within, a sickly yellow glow rising behind an oval pupil. Muscles rippled along hunched backs and down, arms as thick as a man's thigh. Mouths filled with rows and rows of needle-like teeth, spilled out the sides as if there wasn't enough room in their mouths to contain them. "Don't watch, run," Adrian shouted, grabbing hold of her arm and pulling her across the loose mounds of bones. Ulrich and Marvin sped up the steps, heating themselves simultaneously against the great doors. Cajun threw Arista to the ground where she fell, scraping her knee and bruising her cheek, while her protest was silenced as a hail of arrows peppered around them. Sparking off the stones, he hauled her to her feet once more and shoved her forward. "Go," Adrian ordered. She ran as fast as she could, charging up the steps. Myron and Magnus were just slipped inside the big double doors. Waved at her to hurry. She glanced behind her. Gaunt was just reaching the base of the steps. Arrows flew again. Arista heard the hiss, and Adrian pulled her behind the pillars, but Gaunt had no such protection. An arrow caught him in the leg and he fell. Sliding to a stop, he rolled over to his back and cried out. As the first goblin reached him, Teg and Arista screamed. A white dagger slit the gazelle's throat, and the princess spotted Roy straddling the fallen god. 3 more gazelle rushed forward to fell dead almost instantly as Adrian joined Royce. Taking one with each of his swords, distracted the third turn toward the new threat. Just as Roy stepped behind him and the goblin fell, "Get up, you fool," Roy shouted at Gond, grabbing him by his cloak and pulling him to his feet. "Now run, arrow in my leg," was all Gaunt managed to say through gritted teeth. "Look out," Arista shouted as nearly a dozen more gazelle charged. Adrian's swords flashed as he threw himself into the fight. Royce vanished only to reappear and vanish again, his white dagger flashing like a sparkling star in the night. "Back into your holes, you beasts are excited," as you suddenly ran out of the lantern in one hand and a sword in the other. Marvin chased after. His king has already leapt into the fray, fearlessly cleaving into the nearest goblin. Her brother took an arm off his opponent and then ran him through. Arista's heart stopped as Ulrich failed to see the blade of another gazelle swinging from the side at his head. Marvin saw it. A lightning-quick flash of his sword blocked the attack, sliced through the blade, and killed the goblin in one stroke. Gaunt was up and hobbling forward. Arista hiked up a robe and ran back down the stairs to him. "Put your arm around me," she shouted. Moving to his wounded side, God put his weight on her. From behind them, more goblins entered the square. 20, perhaps as many as 30, ran forward, shrieking and yelping, the claws clicking the stone. And a drone came from them, like the sound of a swarm of locusts. "Time to go," Adrian declared, reaching Ulrich. He pulled the lantern from the king's hand and smashed it on the stone. Before the attacking gazelle, a burst of flame rose along with more cries and squeals. "I've got him," Adrian told her. "Run." They all bolted for the doors that Magnus and Myron held open as soon as they entered. The monk and the dwarf pulled them shut. Royce slid the latch. "Get that stone bench in front of the door," Royce shouted. "What bench?" Marvin asked. "It's pitch black in here." Arista barely thought about it, and a robe glowed with a cold blue light that revealed the entrance hall. Musty and stale, it was much like the library, covered in cobwebs and dust. The white and black checkered floor was cracked and uneven. A chandelier that had hung from the ceiling rested in the center of the floor. Frasers lay toppled. Stone molding was scattered and plastered. Ships littered the ground. Great tapestry still clung to either wall. Faded and dirty, they were otherwise unmarred, as were long curtains that draped the walls. Stairs led up from either side of the front doors and past to tall, narrow windows that looked out onto the square. It was then that Arista realized how much like a small castle fortress attached or guild was. Boom, boom, the goblins hammered against the door, shaking the dust off the walls, having laid Gaunt down near the center of the room. Adrian pulled the goblin bow from his shoulder and ran up the steps. He made use of the arrow slits to fire on the goblins. Outside, she heard a cry for every twang of the tiny bow. And soon the hammering stopped. "They've moved off," Adrian said, leaning heavily against the wall, out of bow range at least. "But now that they know they have guests, they won't leave us alone." Royce looked around, scanning the stairs, the ceiling and the walls. "Question is there another way in here? And perhaps more importantly, another way out?" He pulled the remaining lanterns from Myron's pack and began lighting them. Arista moved to go on side. The short, foul-looking arrow had penetrated through his calf, with both ends sticking out. "I can see why you're having such trouble running," she told him as she pulled her dagger and started to cut his trouser leg. "At least someone gives me credit." He growled. "You're lucky, Mr. Gaunt," Hedron said, coming down the stairs and approaching them. He seized the first little lantern and knelt down beside him. "If the tip was still inside your leg, this next process would hurt a lot more." "Next process?" Adrian bent down, and before Arista or Gaunt knew what was happening, he snapped off the arrow's tip. Gaunt howled in pain. "Get some bandages ready," he told Arista. Myron was already there, holding the rose out to her. "Now this will hurt some." "This will," God inquired incredulously. "What you did before." Adrian pulled the shaft from his leg. Gaunt screamed. Blood flowed from the wounds on either side of the leg, and Adrian quickly began wrapping and pulling the cloth. "Put your hands on the other side and squeeze tight." "Real tight," he told Arista. Blood soaked through the white linen, turning it red. "Squeeze harder," he told her as he unrolled a second length of cloth. As she did, Gaunt cried out again, throwing his head back. His eyes went wide for a moment and then squeezed shut. "I'm sorry," she told him. Gaunt groaned through gritted teeth. Blood seeped through her fingers. It was warm and slicker than she had expected. Almost oily. This wasn't the first time she'd found her hands covered in blood, and the square of Rataba with Emery in her arms. There was much more, but she didn't notice it then. "Okay, let go," Adrian told her, and he redressed the wound once again. He had her squeeze as soon as he was finished. More blood soaked the bandages, but it was spotty this time and didn't consume the whole linen. Pedrian wrapped another length and tied it off. "There," he said, wiping his hands. "Now you just have to hope." There was nothing nasty on that shaft. Royce handed him a lantern. "We should look for other entrances. Marvin Ulrich, keep watch out the windows. Shout if they return. I need water," God said, his face dripping with sweat. Arista slipped a pack under his head and seized his water pouch. It appeared more of it dribbled down his chin, then went in his mouth. "Rest," she said, and brushed the hair from his brow. He gave her a suspicious look. "Don't worry, I'm not going to enchant you," she said. When she entered, a robe illuminated the grand hall with a cold, azure light. A great stone table stood in the center, with dozens of tall chairs surrounding it. A few had fallen to their sides, as had a half-dozen metal goblets that rested on the table. The chamber was 4 stories tall, with great windows lining the high gallery and skylights in the ceiling. She imagined that they'd once filled this room, with the wonderful radiance of sunlight painted on the upper walls, and parts of the ceiling were astounding. Scenes of battle, knights rode on horseback, with streamers flying from long poles. Vast valleys were filled with thousands of soldiers, and castle gates defended by archers were sailed by machines of war. In one scene, 3 men battled on a hilltop against 3. Galara Bryn. Those same men were seen in other images, and in one they were pictured in a hall with a throne, but one sat with a crown, and to either side stood the other 2, below the paintings. A varied array of weapons aligned the room. Swords, spears, shields, bows, lances, and maces. The one thing they all had in common, even after 1,000 years they still gleamed. Words were engraved in a band encircling the room, and could also be found on recessed plaques. Yet Arista's training in the old speech was verbal, not written, unable to decipher the meanings. She did spot the words Tesha lore and Sen's lore. A majestic stair gave access to the gallery above, and she ascended it. At the top were a series of doors. Some rooms lay open, and she spied small chambers, living quarters with beds, shelves, and closets. Lantern light spilled from one. She found Hadrian standing near the bed, staring up at the opposite wall as if entranced. He was looking at a suit of armor, a shield, and a set of weapons. The armor wasn't at all like the traditional. Heavy breastplates, cauldrons, vamp braces, and tassets of typical knight attire. This was one piece and appeared as a long formal coat, but made from leaves of gold-colored metal. It hung from a display with a great plumed helm, like the head of an eagle resting on top, planning on moving, and she asked, "I got a little worried when you didn't come back." "Sorry," he said, embarrassed I didn't hear any shouts. "Is everything all right? God is sleeping, Myron reading. Magnus is arguing with all. Rickroy still hasn't returned." And Marvin wandered off. "And what are you doing?" She sat down on the bed, which promptly collapsed under her weight, issuing a cloud of dust. "You all right?" he asked, helping her up. "Yes," she said, coughing and waving her hand before her face. "I guess the wood rotted over the years. This is it," he said. "What?" She brushed the dust from her robe. "This is Garish's room." Garish grilled, the Teshlor knight, who went with the Emperor's son into hiding. "How do you know the shield?" he said, and pointed across the room at the heater shield hanging on the wall. On it was an emblem of twisted and knotted vines, around a star supported by a crescent moon. Adrian reached back and drew forth the long, spot-on sword. He held it up so that she could see the small engraving at the center of the pommel that matched the one on the shield. Then he stood up and crossed the room. As he did, she noticed for the first time that the suit of armor had no sword, but there was a sheath of gold and silver. Adrian fitted the tip into the opening and let the great sword slide home. "You've been parted a long time. Doesn't quite match anymore," Arista said, noticing how the sword was marred to a dull finish. "It has seen 1,000 years of use," Adrian said, defending it. He looked back at the armor. The sword was the only thing he took. I suppose he couldn't expect to hide very well, dressed in shiny gold armor. His fingers played over the gleaming surface of the metal. "Looks like it would fit," she said. He smirked. "What would I do with it?" She shrugged. "Still, it seems like you should have. It goes with the sword anyway." "It does, doesn't it?" He lifted the code. "So light," he said. Stunned, Arista looked back down at the bed, and as she did, noticed a small object, a figurine carved from a bit of smoky quartz. She picked it up and rubbed it clean. It was a statue act of 3 people, a boy flanked by 2 men, one in leaf armor and the other in a robe. The likeness of Azrahaddin was remarkable, except that his figure had hands. Whoever the artist was had a rare gift, interested in what he looked like, she said, and held out the figurine. "He was young," Adrian replied, taking the statuette and turning it over in his hands. "A good face, though." Then his eyes shifted and he smiled, and she knew he was looking at Azrahaddin. "So this must be Navrik. The heir doesn't look like Gaunt, does it? How many generations are there in 1,000 years?" she asked. "Funny that he left this. It's so beautiful. You would have thought he'd taken it with him. Or at least," she paused and glanced around the room. Except for the expected silt of 1,000 years, the room was neat and ordered. The bed made drawers and cabinets closed, a pair of boots standing side by side at the foot of the bed. "Did you straighten up in here at all?" she asked. He looked at her curiously and appeared as if he might laugh. "No," he told her, "it's just that it's so tidy. But because it was a night, you think okay. So there is Elgar, but he's more of an exception. No one is as messy as he is." "But that's not what I meant. It's just that after Garish left, after he took Navrik and ran, I would have thought they would have searched this room, tore it apart looking for clues. But nothing looks out of place, and this figurine. Don't you think they would have taken it? Why didn't they ransack the room? It's been 1,000 years. You'd think they would have gotten around to it by now. Unless maybe they never got the chance. What do you? The blare of a horn, blowing from somewhere outside of the guild hall. Reached them, followed by the distant beat of drums. What's happening? Adrian asked, returning with a wrist to the front of the hall, where Ulrich is once again, at the windows. He carried the armor in a bundle, and the shield over his back. Ulrich shrugged. I don't know, I can't see a thing out there. Did you find an exit? No, everything is sealed by rubble. So on the one hand we're safe, but on the other trapped. I think more are arriving out there. Ulrich mentioned, get your head back from the window before you catch an arrow, Royce told him. Returning from a side hall Arista had not taken. He knelt down beside Gond and looked over his wound. The bleeding had finally stopped, but his face was still moist. Despite the chill in the air, anything? Adrian asked. Roy shook his head, then he looked around concerned. Where's Myron and Marvin? This is the Tesla Guild, Ulrich said. Marvin has wanted to explore this since he was 10. And Myron. Ulrich glanced at Gaunt, who looked up painfully, blinking. Then all of them turned to Magnus. Don't look at me like that. I don't know where he went. He wandered off. I look for him, Roy said. Wait, Alex stopped him. How are we going to get out of here? Don't know, Royce replied. Ulrich slumped against the front wall, with a miserable look on his face. He's not serious, is he? You're the king. God said you tell us you wanted to be in charge. What does your family, heritage, and blue blood breeding say now? What inside has it provided you that we commoners can't see? Shut it, Gaunt more than ordered. Trotting down the stairs, there you are, Royce said. I'm just saying that he's the king, gone with on he's in charge, so far. All that he's managed is to get me bleeding to death, and all of us trapped. This is a perfect chance for him to shine and prove his worth. All the other teams that came in here didn't have a noble king to lead them. Surely he'll not leave us to the same fate as they. Isn't that right, Your Majesty? I said shut it, more than repeated in a lower, more threatening voice. Have you forgotten? He just risked his life to help save yours. Ulrich looked at each of them as they sat around the entrance hall. In the flickering light of 4 lanterns, each casting for separate shadows of everything. I don't know, he said. He peeked back out the window. You heard the horn and the drums. There could be dozens of goblins out there by now. I doubt that, Adrian replied, and Ulrich looked hopefully at him. I would say there were hundreds by now. Gazelle prefer uneven battles, the more one sided the better, as long as it's in their favor. Those horns and drums are calling. All goblins within earshot. Yeah, I would say a couple hundred at least are gathering. Barrack stared at him, shocked. But how are we going to get out then? No one replied. Even Gon gave up his taunting and lay back down. And I was going to be emperor. The imperial hunts were massive. They heard Myron's voice echo as Royce led him back. You can see by that tapestry. Hundreds participated. Thousands of animals must have been killed. And did you see the chariots? He was looking at the art. Royce told them they were master bronze craftsmen. Did you see the monk asked? And this building, this is the guild hall. The Knights Guild Hall, this is the very place. Mentioned in hundreds of books of law, often thought to be a myth. The Hall of Tesh Law, isn't it amazing? Not Tesh Law at all, it's astounding really. In all the years of reading about the old empire, I never found anything about it, but clearly it was true. Treasure law is not a combat discipline or martial art, any more than sense. Law is a discipline of mystical arts, and names Teschler and Senslaw, were the names of people who are with Navran. At the first battle of the Great Elven War, the Teschler Knights were literally the knights trained by Teschler, or actually Teschler. This is hardly the time for studying history. Arig snapped. We need to find a way out before they find a way in. I need a light more than announced. There's a fire or a torch or some. Oh, what don't ask? Well, to things really. The uncanny pickering began. Adrian was right. I can only see silhouettes. But oh yeah, there's a lot out there now. A whole lot. Second, Adrian asked. Second, it looks like they're setting up for flaming arrows. What good is that? Auric asked. This place is stone, there's nothing to burn. Smoke, Adrian replied. They are smoke us out. That doesn't sound good, Gon said. Another locked room, Adrian said to Royce. How many is this? I've lost track. Too many really, ideas, only one, the thief said. And then looked directly at a rooster. She watched Hadrian nod. No, she said. Instantly she stood up and backed away from them. I can't, you have to, Royce told her. She was shaking her head so that her hair whipped her face. Her breath short and rapid and her stomach tightening. Starting to chan. I can't, she insisted. Adrian moved toward her slowly, as if you were trying to catch a spooked horse. Her hands were starting to shake. You saw, you know. What happened last time? I can't control it. Maybe, Adrian told her, but outside that door or anything from, I'm guessing 50 to a few hundred. Baron Gazelle. All the bedtime stories, legends, and fables are true. I know firsthand, and actually they don't tell even half the story. No one would dare tell the real stories to children. I served as a mercenary for several years in Calais. I fought for warlords in the Gorahan Dal, the jungle on the eastern end of the peninsula, that the goblins took back. I've never spoken about what happened there. And I won't now, honestly. I work very hard not to think about it. Those days that I lived under the jungle canopy were a nightmare. The gazelle are stronger than men. Faster too, and they can see in the dark. They have sharp teeth, and if they get the chance, will hold you down and rip into the flesh of your throat or stomach. The gazelle want nothing better than a meal of human meat. Not only are we a delicacy to them, but they also use their victims as part of their religious ceremonies. They'll make a ritual out of killing us, take us alive if they can eat us while we still breathe. They'll drink their black cups of Gurlin bog and smoke Tolan leaves while we scream. That door is the only way out of here. We can't sneak out, we can't create a diversion and hope to catch them off guard. We can't hope for a rescue. Either you do something or we all die. It's as simple as that. You don't know what you're asking me to do. You don't know what it's like. I can't control it. I don't know what will happen. The power is I don't know how to describe it, but I could kill everyone. It just gets out of control. It just runs away. You can handle it. I can't. You can. It caught you off guard before. You know what to expect now. Adrian, if I go too far. She tried to imagine and realized she did not want to. There was an excitement and the thought of the power. A thrill like standing on the edge of a cliff or playing with a sharp knife. The acceleration came from the risk. The very real fear that she could step too far. It lured her like the still beauty of a deep lake, even as she spoke about it. She remembered how it felt, the desire, the hunger. It called her. If I reach beyond, if I go too far, I might not come back. She looked at Hadrian. I'm scared what would happen. I don't think I would be human anymore. I'd be lost forever. He took her hands until he touched her. She not realized she was shaking. His hands felt warm, strong. You can do it. He told her family. He stared into her eyes, and she could not help looking back. There was peace there. A gentle understanding familiar to her now, comforting, reassuring. How does he do it? Her hands stopped shaking. An arrow whizzed through Marvin's window, just missing him. It streaked a thick, dark smoke that stank of sulfur. It flew to the far wall and bounced off the stone, continuing to smolder and burn. Two more managed to find their way into the narrow slits, while outside it sounded as if it were raining. Then a line of smoke began to leak in through the cracks of the door. "You have to try," Adrian told her. She nodded. "But I want you with me. Don't leave me no matter what happens. I swear I will not leave you." His voice and the look in his eyes were so sincere, so resolute. Deegan began to cough, and Marvin and Ulrich ascended down from the stairs. "Everyone gather," she told them in a soft voice, trying to keep her eyes on Adrian. "I don't know exactly what's going to happen. Just try and stay as close as you can, and don't you let go of me, Adrian." Chapter 18, Dust and Stone. The smoke was growing thick, and it was becoming hard to breathe. As Arista remained standing still, muttering. Her eyes closed, her hands twitching. "Is she going to do something?" Don inquired and followed this with a series of coughs. "Give her a second," Adrian told him. As if in response, a light breeze moved within the room. Where it came from, Adrian couldn't tell, but it moved around the chamber, swirling and stealing away the smoke. The wind grew stronger, and soon it ruffled the edges of their cloaks, slapping their hoods and spinning the dust into little whirlwinds that twirled, dancing about. All at once the flames and the lanterns went out, and the wine stopped. Everything was deathly still for a heartbeat. Then the front wall of the guild hall exploded. Arista's robe flared brilliantly, as if from beyond the missing wall. Hadron heard cries of goblins, like a million squealing rats. The square cast in darkness for 1,000 years, later revealed, illuminated as if the sun had returned to the Grand Mar. They could finally see the beauty that had once been. The city of Navran, the city of Persephix, the city of light. "Gather your things," Arista shouted, opening her eyes. But Adrian could tell she was not fully with them. She was breathing deep and low, her eyes never focusing. As if blind to what was around her, she wasn't seeing with her eyes anymore. Marvin and Ulrich hoisted Gaunt between them. He granted, but said nothing as he hopped on his good leg. "Come," she told them, and began to walk towards the collapsed pile that had once been a palace. "You're doing great," Adrian told her. She showed no sign of hearing him. The goblins stayed back. Whether they retreated from the explosion of stone, the harsh light, or some invisible sorcery that Arista was manifesting, all Adrian could tell was that they refused to approach. The party walked as a group clustered around Arista. "This is crazy," Gon said, his voice quavering. "They'll kill us. Don't leave the group," Adrian told them. "They're fitting arrows," Marvin announced. "Stay together." Struggling to shield the rise as they bent their bows, the gazelle launched a barrage. All of the party flinched except Arista. 100 dark shafts flew into the air, burst into flame, and vanished into streaks of smoke. More howls arose from the gazelle ranks, but no more arrows flew, and now more than ever, the goblin showed no willingness to advance. "Finds the opening," she shouted out of breath, her tone impatient, like someone holding up heavy furniture. "Magnus, try and find the hollow corridor." Adrian barked to the left. "Up there, a gap, no, over, farther there." Royce was on it, throwing rocks back. "He's right, there's an opening here." "Of course I'm right," Magnus shouted something. Arista said dreamily. "What was that, Arista?" Adrian asked. She mumbled, and he didn't catch the last few words. He kept his hands on her shoulders, squeezing slightly. Although he wasn't certain if by doing so, he was reassuring her or himself. "Something. I feel something. Something fighting me." Adrian looked up and stared out. Over the Grand Mar of the colony of goblins arriving, massive, insidiously twisted bodies, with dripping teeth and brilliant claws, clacking along the length of spears and swords. He spotted what he looked for beyond them. Moving in a ring around the Eularium fountain, the small, slim figure of the Oberdaza, dressed in a skirt and headdress of feathers, shaking a tulin leaf and dancing his methodic steps. He spotted Dumore joining the first. "We need to get in now," Adrian shattered. Royce threw Myron and a lantern inside the dark hole, and then shoved Magnus after him, before following them inside. Gaunt, Marvin, and Ulrich followed. "We need to go," Agent Altarista. Across the span of the square, he could hear chanting, as two more witch doctors joined in the dance. Something Arista muttered again, something taking shape, something growing. That's why we need to get moving. The lights appeared in the center of the square. No more than a candle flame, it wavered, hovering in midair. Then it began to grow. The light swirled, flared, popped and grew to the size of an apple. The host of the Gazelle army joined in the chant of the three Oberdaza as the hovering ball of fire continued to grow and take shape. Adrian began to see what looked like limbs and a head emerging from the withering fire. "Okay, we really have to go," Adrian said, and seized hold of the princess. The moment he did, she staggered back, looking shocked and frightened. The glow of her robe went out. "What's happening?" Arista asked. He didn't answer, but merely seized her tightly by the wrist and drew her up the rubble to the opening. But he shoved her head first into the hole behind him. He heard the thrum of 100 arrows, taking to the air, and dove into the hole after her. "Go crawl," he shouted to Arista as he did his best to shove rocks up against the opening. She obeyed, and somewhere in the darkness he heard her scream, "Arista!" He turned and scrambled forward, only to fall. Dropping 10 feet, he landed next to her, and the two found themselves lying in the corridor, illuminated by a lantern in Myron's hand. "You two all right?" Royce asked. "That drop is a bit of a surprise." "I'm sorry," Arista was saying, rubbing her back. "I couldn't hold them. There was something fighting me, something I've never felt before. Another power." "It's okay," Adrian told her. "You did great. We're in." "We are." The princess inquired, looking around surprised. "What about getting back out?" God asked. "I'd be more concerned about them following us right now." Agent told him. "The narrow passage will slow their progress, but they'll be coming." "Talk as you walk," Roy said. "I run if you're up to it." "Give me the lantern, Myron. I don't want to fall into any more holes. Maybe we should stay behind and kill them." As they come down, Marvin said to Adrian, "You'll run out of strength before they run out of goblins." Adrian told him, "And then there's that thing the Oberdaza was making thing?" Arista asked. They jogged down the corridor with Royce out front, holding the lantern high to either side were white marble walls, and beneath them a dark, polished floor of beautiful mosaic design. "I don't suppose you saw a map of this place?" Roy said to Myron. "Actually, yes, but it was very old and parts were missing." "Better than nothing. Any idea where we are?" "Not yet." At first, Hadrian thought they stumbled into a room, my great hall by the size of it, but soon it became clear that it was a corridor, but far larger than any Hadrian had ever before seen. Suits of armor, each similar to the one he had found in Jerry's room, stood on either side. The walls were sculptured relief images of men, scenes of battle, scenes of remembrance. They flashed frame by frame as the party raced past. Adrian saw a long succession of men being crowned, with the cityscape in the background. In each one, the city was smaller, the crowning ceremony less lavish. Two things caught his notice as they ran. The first was that in every instance, the head of the man being crowned was scratched out, deliberately chipped away. The second was that in each depiction, although the crowd always appeared different, Adrian could swear the artist used the same model for one figure, a tall, slender man who appeared in the forefront in each scene. And while in the dim fluttering candlelight, it was difficult to tell, Agent was certain he had seen the man before. They came to a four-way intersection. To the left was an incredible door, 5 stories tall, made completely of gold and inlaid with stunning geometric designs. Of such artistry, each of them expelled a sound of awe. "Imperial throne room," Myron said. "In there once sat the ruler of the world." "You know where we are then?" Royce asked. Myron nodded, looking at the walls. "Yes, I think so." "Which way to the crypt?" The monk hesitated, closing his eyes for a second. "This way." He pointed forward down to doors. "Then we take a stair down on the left." They quickly reached the stair and Royce led them down. Gaunt grunted, limping along with one arm around Myron's shoulders, his fist holding onto the monk's rope belt. "Obataza," Arista said to Hadron, as they chased the end of the line. "You mentioned them before when we were in Hintanda, didn't you? You said they were witch doctors who used gazelle magic. Scary little buggers. What was that thing they were making?" "No idea, but it was on fire and growing. I could sense something disrupting the rhythm. Breaking my pattern, my connection. I've never encountered anything like that before. I didn't know what to do. It did great," he told her. "You controlled it real well too. Didn't even get close to losing you this time, in the dim light." He managed to catch a little smile on her face. "I did control it better, didn't I? You helped. I could sense you near me. This warm light, I could cling to an anchor to keep me grounded." "You're probably just afraid I'd hit you again." Behind them down the corridor echoed a tremendous boom. The ground shook under them and dust blew off the walls. "Oh," they reached another stair. "We keep going down, right?" He heard Royce ask. "This tomb thing is at the bottom?" "Yes," Myron replied. "The Imperial Crypt is on the lowest level. The palace was actually built over the tomb of Navran, as a shrine to glorify his memory. It became a ruling palace long after. They came to still another stair and raised downward. Magnus grunting with each drop, at the bottom lake corridors. Smaller and narrower with shorter ceilings. They moved single file, now gone, struggling hopping. A three-way intersection stopped them. 3 statues of long-bearded men holding shields stood before them, staring back. "Well," Royce inquired the monk. "This is where the map was torn," he responded apologetically. "The rest is just white space." "Great," I said. "But we should be close. There wasn't much room left, so it has to be." "Look." The monk pointed at the wall on the right corridor, where an EH was scratched. "Let's hope the gazelle can't read," Roy said, pushing on. "They don't need to. They can smell," Adrian explained. They ran as best they could, chasing the bobbing lantern behind them. The sounds of pursuit grew as the gazelle gained on them. They passed doors on either side of the corridor, which Royce ignored as he rushed forward. Some were partially open. Adrian tried to look inside. Yet the interior of each was too dark to see anything. Drums echoed, and the blast of a horn rang down the stone corridors. Gaunt was bleeding again. Adrian could see dark drops on the floor behind them. If the gazelle had had any trouble tracking them before, they would have none now. Again they stopped. This time at a T intersection, at the center of which stood a large stone door, beside a stone table. They all saw ladders above it carved deep into the arch. "Myron, translate," Royce ordered. "This is it," he said excitedly. "Tread lightly with fear and reverence, all that you enter these halls. For this is the eternal resting place of the emperors of Elan, rulers of the world." Before Myron finished reading, Adrian heard the chilling sound of claws on stone. "They're coming." Royce pulled on the door and struggled with it. Adrian and Marvin pushed forward. Together they seized hold of the edge and pulled, to the sound of heavy stone grinding. The sharp clacking of hundreds of 3-inch nails grew louder. As behind them a fiery red light appeared and grew, they all passed through the opening, and together pulled the door shut. As they did, as the door closed, Adrian peered out the closing crack and glimpsed the sight of a giant, stooping figure made of flame, striding down the corridor at them. "There's no way to lock it, all right," shouted out on my way. The dwarf fell to his knees and, drawing his hammer, pounded on the hinges. There was an immediate crack that'll slow them. Ahead was another very narrow downward stair. Here the stone was different. It cast a bluish hue and was carved in fluid, curving lines. Boom. The gazelle reached the door and struck it hard. "Run," Adrian called forward, and Royce reached the bottom of the stairs in seconds, waiting for the rest to join him. Boom. Adrian glanced over his shoulder, watching Myron help Gaunt down. There was a loathsome clicking on the far side of the door, and he imagined all those claws scratching. Magnus remained on his knees, picking up wedges of broken stone and hammering them into cracks to hold the door tight. Boom! A red glow was visible seeping in around the edges. Licks of flame curled through like long fingers. Reaching, searching the door won't stop them. Arista said. She too remained on the landing, standing before the door, and Adrian could see tension in her face. And we can't keep running. They'll eventually catch us. I have to stop them. Go on ahead. You tried that, Adrian told her Stanley. I didn't understand, then I'll do better this time. A little body was breathing fast as she started unblinking at the door, her hands clenching and unclenching. There's 3 of them and only one of you. And there's this fire thing. You go, she shouted. It's the only way. Boom. Cracks appeared across the face of the door. Bits of stone chipped off and fell on the dwarf's head. Go on, all of you. She closed her eyes and began to mutter. Myron and Gaunt were finally at the bottom. Magnus followed, quickly vaulting down the steps. Marvin and Ulrich hesitated partway down, but Adrian remained reluctant to leave her. Boom! The door fractured, the hands of flames bending around, gripping tight, ripping at the stone. Arista's robe burst forth a brilliant white light, the stairs illuminated so harshly. Everyone shielded their eyes. Boom! The door buckled. No, you don't, Arista shouted above the thunder of the stone. White light rushed to the door, circling it and forcing back the red fire, filling the gaps. The flaming fingers recoiled and fought. Writhing and twisting sparks erupted where the two met. From the far side, they all heard an unnatural howl of pain that shook the bowels of the stone. A loud crack shuddered through the walls, and like a candle she blew on, the fiery light went out with a snap. Arista remained on the landing, her face slick with sweat, her arms up, her fingers weaving in the air, as if she were playing an invisible harp. The stone of the doors glowed with a blue light, brightening and ebbing like a luminous heartbeat. Her movements became faster, her hands jerking. She grunted and cried out as if in alarm. No, she shouted. A wind filled the space around her. Arista's hair whirled and snapped, a robe blowing, billowing out, shimmering like the surface of a moon. Struck like Arista, he called to her there. There she was, clearly struggling, fighting something. The pulsing light on the door sped up, growing faster and faster. She screamed, and this time her head dodged to one side. She took a step backward, and with another Grant struggle to throw her weight forward. Now fighting me. She cried out again, and Hadrian felt. A powerful gust of wind burst through the door. It staggered both of them. Hadrian placed a hand on the wall to keep from falling. More than 3, she said. Oh dear Marable, I can't. Her face was straining, her jaw clenched. Her eyes watered and tears fell down her cheeks. I can't hold them, run, run. The door exploded, bits of stone flew, cracking across the walls. Splitting and quizzing, dust blossomed in a cloud. Arista flew back, crumpling to the floor, a light all but out. The robe managed only a quivering purple glow. No, Adrian shouted. He seized hold of her and lifted. Just as through the door the goblin horde charged. They broke through the fog of dust, with snarling teeth and glowing eyes. They attacked with satchels held high, fanged mouths, spitting curses and dripping with anticipation. Ulrich drew forth the sword of Tolan Essendon. In the name of Navran and Maribore, he shouted fiercely. As he charged up the steps with Marvin close behind, the shimmering blade of Count Pickering slid free of its sheath. Back, the king cried, back to Oberlin, you mangy beasts. Adrian ran down the steps, cutting the princess to his chest. Behind him, he could still hear Ulrich cursing the goblins, the blades ringing and the gazelle's screams. As Adrian reached the bottom, Arista was stirring, her eyes fluttering open. He handed her to Myron, keep her safe. He turned, drew his swords, and ran back up the steps with Royce right behind him. Above him, Marvin and Ulrich fought. as dark blood splattered the walls and spilled down the steps. Already a mount of bodies lay on the landing. He was still 3 steps away when Ulrich cried out. And fell. Ulrich, Marvin shouted. He turned to his fallen king. Just as a satchel blade stabbed out, Marvin cried out in pain, but managed to cleave the head from the goblin. Shoulders. Pull back, Marvin. Adrian shattered, stepping over Ulrich, standing shoulder to shoulder. The two filled the width of the corridor and fought like a single man with 4 arms. The whirl of their blades was daunting, and after 3 attempts the goblins hesitated. The goblins paused their assault and stood beyond the broken door, staring at them across a pile of gazelle bodies. Marvin, take Ulrich and go, Adrian ordered, breathing hard. You can't hold them yourself. Marvin replied, you're bleeding, and I can hold them long enough. Get your king away. Marvin glared at the grinning teeth across from him. Adrian could see at least 2 of the Oberdaza, lying face down on the stone table, and thought she gave as good as she got. Take him, Marvin. Your duties to him Ulrich may yet live. Take him to Arista. Marvin sheathed to sword and stooping. He lifted Ulrich and retreated down the steps. The goblins moved a step forward, then hesitated once more. As Royce appeared beside Hedron, ugly little buggers, he appraised the faces across the threshold. Pressure from the back was pushing the goblins reluctantly forward. How long before they remember they have bows? Royce whispered they aren't the brightest, particularly when scared. Adrian explained. In many respects they're like a pack of herd animals. If one panics they all follow suit. But yeah, they'll figure it out. I'm guessing we got maybe a minute or 2. Looks like we should have been winemakers after all, huh? Oh, now you think of it. Royce chilled. We'd be in our cottage around a warm fire right now. You'd be sampling our wares and complaining it wasn't good enough. I'd be making lists for the spring. No, Roy said. It's 5 in the morning. I'd still be in bed with Gwen. She'd be curled up in a ball, not be watching her sleep, and marveling at how her hair lay up on her cheek, as if Maribor himself had placed it there in just that way. For me, and in the crib, my son Elias and my daughter Mercedes would be just waking up. Adrian saw him smile. Then, for the first time since Gwen's death, why don't you go down with the others and leave me here? Roy said you might be able to get a little farther, a little closer to the tomb. Maybe there's another door, a door with a lock. You spend enough time with me already. I'm not going to leave you here. Adrian told him why not. There are better ways to die. Maybe this is my fate, my reward for the life I lived. I wish these bastards had been at the bridge that night, or at least that Merrick had fought better. I regret it now, killing him. I mean, he was telling the truth. He didn't kill Gwen. I guess I'll just tack that on too. All the other regrets of my life. Go on, leave me. Royce, Adrian. Myron called to them from the bottom. Run. We can't, Adrian said, when he noticed a white light growing below them and felt a rising wind. Oh, son of A! The stairs trembled and rock cracked. Bits of stone shattered and flew in all directions, hitting them like stinging bees. Adrian seized hold of Royce and leapt headlong down the steps. A loud roar issued from above them. As goblins screamed and the ceiling collapsed, Adrian Arista cried. Outer robe brightened and Myron held his lantern high, but you couldn't see through the cloud of dust. She staggered on her feet, lightheaded and dizzy. Her legs were weak and her thoughts muddy, swaying with her arms reaching out for balance. She stared into the gloom of swirling dirt, her heart pounding. Oh God, don't let them be dead. Cut that a little close, didn't you? She heard Adrian's voice emerging out of the mark. The fighter and the thief crawled out of the haze. Covered in what looked to be a splendid coating of gray chalk, they waved their hands before their faces and coughed repeatedly as they ascended over the rubble to join the others. In the narrow corridor behind them, the way was sealed. Royce looked back. Well, that's one way to lock the mad. Not a good way, but a way. I didn't know what else to do. I didn't know what else to do. she said while her hands opened and closed nervously. Arista felt on the edge of losing control. She was exhausted and terrified. "He did great," Adrian told her, taking her hands and holding them gently. Then looking past her, he inquired more than, "How is he?" "Not good," the cat responded with a quavering voice. "Still alive, though." The new Count Pickering was on his knees, holding Ulrich, and brushing the king's hair from his face. Ulrich was unconscious. A large amount of dark blood pooled on the ground. Around him, "The fool," Marvin said. He put his arm up to block like he had a shield. 'Cause he always practiced with a shield. The blade cut his arm open, from the shoulder to the elbow. When he tried to turn, they sliced open his stomach. Marvin wiped tears from his eyes. "He fought well, though, really well. Better than I've ever seen. Better than I thought he could. It was almost like I was fighting beside Fan again." The tears continued to run down Marvin's cheeks, faster than you could brush them away. Ulrich's chest was moving, struggling up, bent down. A terrible gargle bubbled up his throat. With each raspy breath, "Give me the lantern." Hadron rapidly bent down over the king. He tore open his shirt, revealing the wound. The moment Adrian saw it, he stopped. "Oh dear, Navrin," he said. "Do something," Arista told him. "There's nothing I can do," he told her. "The sword, it went through. I've seen this before. There's just nothing. The bleeding won't stop, not the way he's. I can't. Damn, I'm so sorry." His lips sealed together, and his eyes closed. "No," Arista said, shaking her head no. She fell and crawled to Ulrich's side, placing her hand on his head. She felt he was hot and drenched in sweat. "No," she repeated, "I won't allow it." "Arista," she heard Hadron. But she had already closed her eyes and began to hum. She sensed the dull, solid forms of the old walls, the dirt and the stone, the air between them, the bodies and the flow of Ulrich's blood. Does it spill on the ground? She could see it in her mind, as a glowing river of silver, and the glow was fading. "Arista," the sound of Adrian's voice echoed, but it was faint, as if coming from a distance. She saw a sliver of darkness that appeared as a tear, a dark rip in the fabric of the world. She reached out and felt the edges, pulling them wider until she was able to pass through. Inside it was dark, darker than night, darker than a room after blowing out a candle. It was the darkness of nothing. She peered deep into the void, searching. Eric was there ahead of her and drifting away. Pulled by a current like some dark river, she chased after him. "Oh, Rick." She called, "Arista." She heard him say, "Arista, help me." Ahead she saw light, a single point that glimmered white. "I'm trying, stop and wait for me." "I can't. Then I'll come and get you," she said and pushed forward. "I don't want to die," or Rick told her. "I won't let you, I can save you." Arista struggled forward, but progress was hard. The river that pulled Ulrich away pushed her backward and confounded her legs. She fought, driving against the wash, even as Ulrich glided across the surface. Despite the difficulty, she was getting closer. A brother looked back at her, his face frightened. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sorry I wasn't a better brother, a better king. Arista, you should have ruled instead of me. You were always smarter, stronger, more courageous. I was jealous. I'm sorry. Please forgive me." She reached out and almost got hold of him. The fingertips touched briefly, then he slipped away. She watched as he picked up speed. The current grew stronger, pulling him away, rushing him forward, stealing him from her.